From the top rope, and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $99 million studio. I'm the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. December 21, 1998 Observer Newsletter. Montreal Part 2. Entire Vince Bret conversation from Backstage. By Observer staff. More than 1 year after the actual event took place, it appears that the U.S. air date of the Hitman Hart, Wrestling with Shadows hopefully, Vince McMahon willing since half his booking ideas seem to come from attempts to gain some sort of personal retribution, will finally put closure to what without question will go down as the most famous ending of a match in North American history. Bret Hart is among the leading candidates to be the pro wrestler of this decade. He's one of the best in-ring performers of this generation. Vince McMahon is the most successful wrestling promoter ever, and from a historical standpoint is probably the most important one of all time, although some would argue the latter point. Yet for all of Hart's great matches and all of McMahon's business accomplishments, the defining moment in both men's professional lives and possibly even what both will over the long haul most be remembered for, at least personally, is chronicled in this movie. The documentary, which aired last month in Canada, and airs from 9 to 11 p.m. on the A&E network on December 20th, has gotten unanimously positive reviews from every media source in North America that has reviewed it, which is amazing given the subject of the movie is pro wrestling. Certainly that is a first for any movie on pro wrestling, or even with a theme revolving around pro wrestling. The version of the movie on television will be the child-friendly videotape version, with some language edits from the original version. It was given an A in the December 18th issue of Entertainment Weekly and a positive review for the movie, but not for the wrestling industry, the current TV Guide in Phil Mushnick's Sportsview column and the most glowing review of all by film critic Barbara Phillips in the December 14th Wall Street Journal. The E review states, Bret Hart nails the essence of Shadows when he muses that, as phony as pro wrestling is, it's realer than people think. This artfully trenchant documentary shows how things got all too real for the grappling hero as he neared what he hoped would be a dignified retirement from the World Wrestling Federation. Turns out the league's own Dr. Evil, Vince McMahon, had other plans. More than that though, it's a revealing gaze into the mechanics of the multi-billion-dollar biz, and the muscle men who get ground up in its gears. Mushnick used the movie as the backdrop for noting that pro wrestling's recent success has transpired without much critical inspection by mainstream journalists, who see wrestling as largely a cartoon world, and as Mushnick writes, so a twisted, sickening industry grows wealthy while operating with impunity. Mushnick brought up the angle of a few months back where Kaientai went to castrate Val Venus, and noted the WWF being banned from the Catholic Youth Center in Scranton, and that pro wrestling's steroid problem and sudden deaths of performers in their 20s and 30s received comparatively little attention. Phillips, who said up until seeing this movie, she couldn't tell WCW from WWF and was not a wrestling fan, said I was pinned to the living room couch for the entire length of the movie. The review focused far more on the parts of the movie about the life of Hart growing up in a wrestling family, his relationship with his father, and Hart's take on his leaving the WWF, and actually barely touched on the movie's climax of what went on in Montreal, concluding by saying, "This is truly a knockout film." I'm sure everyone seeing this movie for the first time will come to their own conclusions of what cannot be simplified into a black and white or right versus wrong issue, although many will choose to do so. I'm going to save my own thoughts on this subject for next week's issue, after every reader at least in the United States that wants to see how the movie turned out has that chance to see it for themselves. But it is a situation where because one side is right, doesn't necessarily make the other side wrong, or where one side is wrong, doesn't necessarily make the other side right. Or where by pointing out wrong in one side that may be and in this case probably is totally irrelevant in justifying wrong actions on the other side. The movie did an excellent job with the story, but it was a movie produced to be a good movie while remaining accurate, and the accuracy is overall excellent. But is still a movie, and thus couldn't be bogged down in all the details that would confuse the general public and for that matter nearly all wrestling fans to the issues the movie itself is about. But those details are important to explaining the story as to what happened and why to those who want to know the real truth of November 9, 1997. Whether Titan Sports will answer back in a form other than another year of petty booking attempts at humiliation of Hart, either by mocking the finish on nearly every show or humiliating Owen in Canada, either in its publications, on its website, or even on its Raw program the next night, doesn't seem certain. There are varying schools of thought as to what the company's public reaction will be. Clearly those who state the movie isn't a big deal to them haven't followed the storylines of Raw, which took an abrupt turn to mimic events of the movie, and even of that night in Montreal which ended up not in the movie, for much of the last 13 months in some form. But the mimicking picked up in a big way after McMahon had received an advanced copy of a rough version of the movie, and has continued strongly through events of this past week. There are schools of thought as to why Titans shouldn't answer back, being that the portrayal of McMahon in the movie is consistent with their storylines. But at previews, it was clear even to the general audience what in the movie was storyline and what wasn't, and only the densest wrestling fans won't be able to point out the evil Mr. McMahon on television and the very real Vince McMahon in the movie that the television character derives are as different as the real person, and an actor playing a role he was born to play. Realistically, the company on television has spent the past year doing almost nothing but answering back to a degree that has been often entertaining, and at times perversely pathetic. Some of this is direct, much more in a sly manner. Hart in media interviews promoting the movie has stated that from what he understood, the two things that upset McMahon the most about the movie is that, unbeknownst to him, it contained a brief portion of the actual conversation where they discussed the finish hours before the match in Montreal, basically proving that McMahon had agreed to a DQ finish, which Hart believes basically shows he was the one telling the truth, since McMahon originally portrayed it to everyone as Hart in their conversation that day refusing to drop the title anywhere at any time, although he clearly was not going to do that specific job. But long before the movie came out, it was common knowledge McMahon agreed to a finish and double-crossed Hart, and reluctantly even admitted on TSN's Off the Record by McMahon himself, but only when backed into a corner by Michael Landsberg. The other was the scene of a shaken, disheveled McMahon limping out of the locker room after coming out of the short side of a one-punch knockout, which to this day he tries to categorize as his valiantly allowing Hart a free shot to the face, a version of what happened contradicted by nearly every eyewitness to the incident. The former point in a sense was bad news for McMahon, because his personal credibility due to his portrayal of the events as Hart refusing to do business at the end to not only the rest of the employees in his company, but to the boys themselves, is shot in the movie. Even with the company flourishing, it's a trust level among the top guys, even when they get along with him, that can never fully be had. His claims were that Hart had refused to drop the title at all, as opposed to simply not wanting to do it in Canada for Michaels. The fact, which wasn't spelled out in the movie, was both sides had already agreed before the match in Montreal where, Springfield, Massachusetts, when, December 7, 1997, and how, in a Four Corners match with Michaels winning, the title would change hands even though as it turned out, neither side truly wanted it to end that way. The movie accurately makes it clear Hart refused to lose to Michaels in Canada, and he clearly had the contractual right to do so. He still had 3 weeks left on his contract to drop it anywhere else. He also had an agreement from Eric Bischoff that he could work 8 extra days with the WWF while on the WCW payroll starting in December, if necessary, to drop it on the next WWF pay-per-view and give a farewell speech on Raw the next night, if a pay-per-view show as opposed to a Raw taping or a house show was the form McMahon wanted to change the title on. Hart, a few hours before the match in Montreal, did suggest, but did not come even close to demanding, a change in the agreed-upon scenario to where he'd simply vacate the title and give a farewell speech the next night at the live Raw in Ottawa, wanting to go out as champion and do his farewell in an environment where it would be guaranteed the best possible crowd reception, all of which McMahon agreed to. However, the wheels had been in motion for McMahon's plan long before Hart came in with that suggestion. As to why, there are several theories. Hart, and people close to him in hindsight, believe McMahon was planning almost from the day he signed the 20-year deal, to find a way out of the contract and that he never intended to honor it. Their belief is that McMahon felt due to the timing of Hart as a free agent being the biggest star in the company, coming on the heels of Kevin Nash and Scott Hall jumping and WWF at its lowest point in history when it comes to TV ratings, even though actual live attendance wasn't bad at that point in time in 1996, that he feared Hart leaving and the public reaction to it to the degree he'd do anything to keep him. As these negotiations were going on, there were several periods where WWF higher-ups conceded the probability of Hart going to WCW, on the grounds that WWF, which at the time was operating rather deeply in debt, legitimately couldn't afford to match the WCW contract offer, a $2.8 million annual base salary for 3 years plus merchandising and other percentages that pushed the total to around $3 million. McMahon talked of things like loyalty and family and offered a 20-year contract to prove it. Was McMahon bitter from almost the moment he signed him for a wrestler putting him in that kind of position? Did McMahon hold a grudge when Hart wouldn't tear up the WCW contract live on Raw during his interview saying he was WWF for life, as requested, a decision that in hindsight was the smartest one Hart made during that entire period, and plot to ruin his career? Or did things just turn out the way they did because McMahon was locked in the most bitter fight of his life, his company was in debt, and probably more important from an ego standpoint, And if you haven't learned by now that the pro wrestling business from almost all sides is run far more for ego enhancement than for maximizing profits, he was losing the big publicized fight every Monday night, and whatever he was doing with his top characters was just what seemed to be the best thing at that moment to try and turn around that fight. I'd suggest the war with WCW and making money for his company was the main focus of his booking, and not attempting to ruin the career of Hart by putting him in the title match against Sid too early after his return and him not winning, giving him that one-day title reign after Shawn Michaels walked out rather than jobbing for Sid, and having to put Sid over on Raw to create the most financially disastrous WrestleMania in history with Undertaker versus Sid in the title match, and then turning Hart into a strong heel, and months later, back into a half-assed babyface for the inevitable showdown with Michaels that had been brewing for 19 months. One look at the booking of Undertaker this year should show that plans aren't made this far in advance, and even with the top guys, the storylines when looked back on make absolutely no sense. How things turn out is more a subject to how the winds blow. In the middle of that bitter of a promotional war, my belief is that McMahon was far more concerned about winning than flattening out the character of his highest-paid performer, but there are other unpublicized scenarios, not at the Hart level, but consistent with the Hart scenario in McMahon's negotiating recent past. Hart's personal viewpoint in hindsight as to why does seem to be the most popular theory that I've heard. Either way, the end result of the hotshot booking, of giving him the shot too fast, making him a one-day champion going heel, then half-ass face with him, did succeed in flattening him out to a degree, but even so, he was the biggest pay-per-view draw for WWF in 1997, and at the time he left was one of the hottest wrestlers in the business. His match with Michaels in Montreal was still the WWF's biggest money pay-per-view show and match of that year. As it turned out, McMahon felt a younger Michaels and Steve Austin had surpassed Hart and were grooming them for the top two spots, which left Hart and his $1.5 million per year contract, which didn't include any bonuses for headlining PPVs or for merchandise sales, being double what Michaels was earning, and at the time, many times what Austin's base was. And at the time the company was losing money. Hart's contract, which at this point no doubt McMahon felt bitter about because he felt Hart had somehow forced him into the deal by negotiating with the enemy. McMahon is notorious in all controversies for only seeing his side of the issue, was something he wanted restructured for months to ease weekly cash flow problems. One top WWF official stated to me in the days after Survivor Series that McMahon promised Michaels, who was younger and some would argue better and was threatening to quit the company after a backstage fight with Hart that he came out on the short end of, that he'd get rid of Hart to pacify Michaels. Of course McMahon has denied that, and he's the only one who knows the true story, and the one whose answers have been somewhat vague, and even so, his credibility in most of his remarks on the subject as time went on ended up being shot to hell. In published interviews with Michaels after the fact, he certainly seemed well aware of the idea that McMahon was forcing Hart out. The fact also is that McMahon did change his tune when the company's finances turned around, ironically during the period when Hart was the main heel draw, and Hart could have stayed for the 20-year deal, although he may have just been saying that to get Hart to agree to do the job, or it may have been an honest appraisal of the situation. Either way, it was clear he'd no longer be the top guy in the company. When Bischoff put another big offer on the table, believed to be $7.5 million over 3 years with a 120-date maximum as opposed to his 180-date maximum with WWF, and while he could stay with WWF, he wouldn't be the top guy, a spot he was basically promised when he originally chose to smaller money offer and longer-term deal in the first place. He chose the WCW deal. McMahon's first request for Hart to lose the title to Michaels in Montreal took place on October 21, 1997, but McMahon promised him it would be a one-month deal with Hart regaining the title on December 7. McMahon had 1 month earlier, on September 22, 1997, told Hart in Madison Square Garden that the company was having financial problems, and from all concerns the company was in debt at this time and there were reasons, and we're not clear what, that it was important to operate out of the red, and that he couldn't afford the contract. Months earlier McMahon had opened discussions with Hart about changing the structure of the deal, promising to pay him his full amount at the other end or when pay-per-view revenue came in, but wanted to considerably lower his approximately $28,800 weekly check, nearly in half. Proposals Hart refused because he didn't trust he'd get the money at the other end. Clearly the portrayal of some watching the movie of Hart being duped by a man he trusted isn't altogether accurate, as his wife Julie Hart, now ex-wife, wasn't the only one who didn't trust McMahon. It appears Hart's mistake was that he did fully trust Earl Hebner and thus allowed himself into the position. If he did fully trust McMahon, he wouldn't have called the film crew, which had already finished shooting all the wrestling scenes for the movie, to document his final week in the WWF, nor would he have been secretly wired, which was actually a suggestion from Julie. There had already been a scenario a few weeks earlier where an angle was done to position the Hart Foundation as racists, writing the dreaded N-word in graffiti in the dressing room of the Nation of Domination. Hart was upset at that angle and refused to do it, basically being okay at being anti-American, a portrayal he could justify to his Canadian fans at home within his basically self-written storyline, as he was trying to protect his image in that country long-term, but not as being a white racist, which wouldn't fly in Canada either. McMahon had the angle done anyway, largely using Michaels' interviews to suggest things that were done that Hart had actually refused to do, going so far as calling Hart the Grand Wizard, a Ku Klux Klan leader reference. McMahon suggested that if Hart wouldn't agree to restructure the deal, that he was going to breach it, which would make Hart a free agent. Knowing he'd be able to do so anyway once the deal was breached, it was hardly magnanimous of McMahon to suggest Hart look elsewhere, WCW, to see what he could get. After being shaken up by the conversation, a few days later, Hart actually asked for legal permission to do so, and the two sides worked out a deal where Hart could negotiate until the end of October. Based on a contract clause, if Hart left, the creative control would kick in for the final 30 days. What McMahon's actual thought process was at this time is something only he knows. Did he believe WCW wouldn't come close to its original offer and thus he really wasn't risking losing Hart? Did he believe Hart really wouldn't leave, because he had already turned down an offer of a lifetime 1 year earlier? Or did he want him out? Given the realities of business at the time, he couldn't have believed WCW wouldn't be interested, but he may have believed Hart really wouldn't be interested in leaving. Given the situation in the business at the time, it's hard to believe he wanted him with the opposition, although he has after the fact stated he wanted him out, although he clearly wanted him earning less money and arguing less about his programs. When Hart made the decision to leave, McMahon and others in the company tried to portray the decision by Hart as being about nothing but money. Hart, who at the time the request to drop the title to Michaels was given, was under the impression McMahon was going to breach his contract, plus given his personal animosity with Michaels, who had many times refused to job for him and others in the company, including coming up with some pretty clever excuses every time he was supposed to drop a title in the ring, and the fact the match was in Canada, was reluctant to do so. It should be noted that at this point in time, Hart was working without a net. There was no bona fide deal from WCW at this point in time. McMahon felt the ball was in his court as Hart at this point had no leverage. Whether it was to soften Hart up for doing the job for Michaels or simply the truth, 3 days after asking for him to lose to Michaels in Montreal and being turned down, McMahon told Hart the company's finances had turned around, which looking back on things appears to also be true from a timeline standpoint, and he was going to honor his 20-year contract in full without deferring payments. Bischoff, who doesn't do anything until the last minute, knowing that Hart had until November 1st to make up his mind, gave him a huge offer on October 31st. Hart went back and forth with McMahon the next day on scenarios for his WWF future, which were still Hart losing in Montreal and regaining the title 1 month later in Springfield, Massachusetts. Later that night McMahon changed the scenario, this time with Hart losing in Montreal but regaining the title on January 19th in Fresno, or dropping it to Austin at WrestleMania. It did appear by the nature of the proposal by this time McMahon did want Hart out, since he laid out a scenario where Hart would be losing 4 of his next 5 major matches, 3 to Michaels. Ultimately he was going to be positioned behind Austin and Michaels on the pecking order, and based on that, combined with a bigger offer elsewhere, he made his decision to leave. So McMahon wanted him to lose, but by giving notice to leave, Hart had reasonable creative control over the next 30 days. McMahon came up with numerous scenarios to get Hart to agree to lose in Montreal, all of which were screw job finishes and none of which Hart would agree to. The idea pushed the hardest at the end being the Hart Foundation turning on Bret and costing him the title in Montreal, thereby making Owen Hart, Davey Boy Smith and Jim Neidhart into full-fledged heels in Canada as well for screwing the Canadian hero and their own family member in Canada, and giving that group some hill steam, particularly in Canada. They'd lose for their biggest star not being a part of their group. On November 2nd, McMahon and Hart agreed to a DQ finish and the scenario of Michaels getting the title in a Final Four match which would include Undertaker and Ken Shamrock, where Hart wouldn't be the one to do the job for Michaels. Bischoff also agreed to the deal since technically the match where Hart was to lose the title would take place after his WCW contract started. That finish changed several times during the week, including a plan suggested by McMahon on November 4th for Hart to beat Michaels clean, which McMahon claimed that Michaels had agreed to, only for McMahon to call Hart up the next day claiming Michaels had changed his mind, and in that conversation, McMahon went back to insisting Hart lose the title because the news was out that Hart was leaving. When Hart said he wouldn't lose it in Canada, McMahon suggested losing the title on November 8 in Detroit, the final house show before Montreal. Hart vetoed that idea, feeling he had to come into Montreal due to all the hype for the match which had taken on a life of its own, particularly in Canada due to all the pub and rumors. Holding the title belt or the match would become flat and totally anticlimactic, but was willing to drop it at any house show once they left Canada. By this point, heat between the two has developing behind the scenes, with Hart being very critical in the Canadian media of the new direction of the company, bringing up both sexual and racial angles in particular and the exploitation of Brian Pillman's death the next day for ratings, including the specifics of the angle he was portrayed in that he'd refused to do, saying he wouldn't let his kids watch the television anymore. As told by McMahon to protect the pay-per-view business, ironically, the markets where it was common knowledge Hart was leaving, pay-per-view business was more than double the markets where it wasn't common knowledge. Hart hinted he might be leaving but never quite said it. McMahon responded with his own press release, obviously mad at Hart's criticism, believing Hart's criticism of the product were to position himself as the babyface in the split, noting Hart himself had sworn doing an angle on live television, when McMahon believed it was all about money and not about product content. The feelings between the two heightened when Hart was asked to do a job in a six-man tag on November 7 in Toronto, Undertaker and Austin and Mankind vs. Hart and Davey Boy Smith and Neidhart, for Austin Stunner, and refused, saying it was in Canada and he was the only Canadian in the main event, thinking it was the wrong thing for the show. His creative control had kicked in, and partner Neidhart did the favor. McMahon and others in the company tried to position this internally as Hart refusing to job to Austin, who he had no heat with, noting that Austin had put Hart over in their previous year's Survivor Series and WrestleMania matches. The next night in Detroit, Hart was booked by the office once again to do the job in the same six-man, but the agents at the building didn't even bother asking him, and asked Neidhart instead. Somehow in the miscommunication, the word got to the office that Hart had refused again, this time not in Canada, which is where some in the office thought he wasn't being business, although McMahon himself knew the truth about Detroit as well, as their conversation in Montreal shows. So nothing was truly settled regarding Montreal, although the finish talked about from all accounts at the production meeting the night before was still a DQ, leading to a title change to Michaels at the Final Four in Springfield. There is some circumstantial evidence that leads me to believe that the night before there were people aware of the planned double cross, with the unanswered question being Jim Ross' hotline report and pregame show report that this could be Hart's final match in the World Wrestling Federation, when the storyline idea agreed on was that Hart would be around for one more month, including the next pay-per-view show. The fact McMahon wouldn't be doing the broadcast as usual had been part of the meeting the night before. There was also a production sheet where it listed playing Michaels' music at the end of the match that was printed up a few days before the match. There is clear proof in documentation form that the day before Montreal, Hart was willing to lose the title to anyone but Michaels, and he later even changed his tune regarding Michaels, anywhere but in Canada. Which leads to what actually happened in the conversation. What aired in the movie was edited down to a few sentences regarding the specific finish agreement, which makes what some would say was the key point of the movie, and quite frankly, without Hart being wired, this entire story would be simply one man's word against another's. Something McMahon no doubt was figuring when he started talking on the issue. While the movie was much more than the finish of the Montreal match, it was that finish that gave it its dramatic conclusion. The basics of the conversation, McMahon and Hart agreeing to the DQ finish, but not the conversation itself, is already well known by now to virtually everyone in and around this industry, except for those who are still so smart that they believe this was all just an angle. This is the actual conversation, and also not the complete version because much of it dealt with things having nothing to do with the match and the period leading to the match, but this is an exact version of what went down as it regarded the match. The parts not mentioned here are non-relevant issues such as the story behind Remembrance Day, a holiday in Canada which took place the night of the match. McMahon, have you given some more thought on what you'd like to do? Hart, I think what I'd like to do is get through today, and I think tomorrow I should go in and do my speech and forfeit the title. I think everyone on the planet knows, and I think it allows me a chance to leave with my head up and leave in a nice way. If I lose anywhere, everyone knows I'm going to lose. They're waiting for it. And then at the same time for the next few weeks I can have matches where I think people would be kind of sympathetic. I got the feeling last night in Detroit that they kind of booed me, but I was a heel all the way through the match until the end of the match. Then when I walked around there, everyone was very emotional. People were crying, hugging me. It was like a 10-minute walk around the ring. I don't think they dropped. It was not a work anymore. I think that's the right way to do it. McMahon, sensing that, it seems like everybody knows. There does seem to be that sympathy factor, too. Hart, I think I would feel really good about that. It would make me feel better. Me and Sean could take the edge off. I don't have to beat Sean. We could have a schmaz, run a non-finish, or whatever you want. For me, I don't have any authorization or permission from Bischoff to do anything more than what I asked them. I haven't spoken to anybody. McMahon, that's what Patterson told me. Hart, all I know is that I asked them, can I do a Final Four match on the 7th? And they said that's okay. I don't really know if you want them dictating anything to you or me either, but I don't really have the right to call them back and say, they changed it. I'm working a single match on the 7th. They might say, well, that's not what you promised, or not what you said. The same about tomorrow Nitro. I haven't got, but I believe I will get some kind of word from them that, because I expect to hear from somebody even today, that I can try to get them to stop, or to not announce that I'm going anywhere. I wonder if it's even worth it now. Everyone knows. McMahon, it's probably not. Hart, but I would feel much better doing that. It would give me the right, I'd like to leave and say nice things and leave with. McMahon, yeah. I'm all for that. One of the things I want to ask you about is, what exactly did you mean in that TSN interview when you said something to that extent of that it's not the situation regarding Hart's decision, what it appears, and that's true. It's not. But I didn't know where you're going with, what the hell was that phrase, the deceitful business practices? Hart, I don't know. I was kind of scrambling. I have no idea. To be honest, I felt pretty bad. I felt bad about having to sort of. McMahon, address it. Hart, well, I kind of felt bad that I had to fight as hard all week long to sort of leave with my head up. I thought it wouldn't be such a hard fight. McMahon, well, I appreciate that. Hart, I thought. It's kind of been really hard. I broke out in cold sores and everything. I've been so stressed out on it. Even in Toronto when they asked me to do the job in the 6-man. Geez, why would they beat the only Canadian in the match, in Canada, in Toronto? It's like almost like you, if you wanted to aggravate me or really keep pushing my McMahon stick you with a stick. Hart, yeah. It's like geez, I didn't have a problem last night or anywhere else. But it just seems like it wasn't. Well, I didn't think it was a very good call. McMahon, well you and I have Hart, if it's going to start to get nasty. Like where it's, well I don't want to get nasty. I never ever wanted to leave here with any kind of bad feelings. But this week has been a bad week for me. I feel it's been really bad for me. I feel kind of betrayed a little bit. McMahon, well, I do too a little bit. And it hasn't been a good week for me either. And like I said before, I'm determined this is going to wind up the right way. Because it should. And it should. So let's just make it that way. Hart, work backwards. McMahon, yeah. Hart, and go forward again. McMahon, yeah. Hart, well, that's what I'd like to do. McMahon, okay. Hart, I think it would be the classy way to go. I think it would be applauded by all sides. I think people would look at it as a nice exit for me. Everyone knows. They're thinking, how's he gonna exit? How's he gonna leave? I think it's the right way for me to go. I've never had a problem putting somebody over. I don't so much have a problem putting Sean over. Mind you, I don't appreciate some of the things he said, but my biggest thing is I think how this thing has been depicted, like the way it's aimed. It's really hard for me as a hero here to come up short this weekend, or tomorrow or the next day. And I've had nothing to do with the word getting out. McMahon, I know that. Hart, all I've tried to do is fend off the McMahon, and again, as I mentioned to you when we had these conversations, all we're talking about is Ted Turner. That's what's coming between you and me. And that's all. I can't tell you how appreciative I will always be for everything you've done for this company. And like I said in our previous conversations, I'd just be damned even though it's Ted Turner's money and Ted Turner's all that kind of shit. That's no reason for two people who have spent as much time as we have spent together through the years and have worked as closely as we have had through the years. It's no reason to have any problems. Hart, I couldn't agree more. I didn't want to leave with any problems. Actually, I didn't want to leave at all. And then it's a point where it seemed like there was no other choice but to go. But I've had a lot of hard feelings through the week I think over just what I thought should have been a fairly easy, I should have been able to leave fairly easy for what I've put in. At this point the discussion breaks from the subject talking about other wrestlers, the fax machine story that is in the movie WCW, what he wants to be remembered as a wrestler for, his legacy, and working with Hogan and is hoping the WWF would never erase his history from their history. Hart, I guess that's kind of why I've been so stubborn about this because for my 15 years here, it's been such a great story, McMahon. Hart, well, it's 14 years to see 14 years here. To have it end in 20 minutes on a low note or a less than grand note I'd rather not have it at all. I'd rather not have any of it. I just take so much pride in everything I've ever done here, my Wembley match, my matches with Sean. Hart starts going over his WWF career here and says that so many guys had their best matches with him. McMahon, I think there's no doubt. Not only the guys that are here now, but the guys that were here and left, and haven't had a good one since. Hart, well, I'm gonna miss this place a lot. I'm already feeling it. It was really, really hard. It was hard in the Maple Leaf Garden, and it was hard last night. I'd rather not get into a big head-butting thing over this thing. I'd rather look forward to working the next 3 or 4 weeks and leaving with my head up and just telling my story with a nice, I don't know what you want to do with me for the next 3 weeks. If I go in tomorrow, I'd like to say something really nice. I never intended to have any bad comments to make and leave it on that. McMahon, okay. Hart, it feels better. You never know. You might have me back here anyway. McMahon, I'd love to. Hart, what would you want to do today then? McMahon, I don't know. Maybe some sort of well, we always have DX there to interfere. I'm trying to rack my brain thinking about doing something like this whereby it won't end too. You know, you had Sean and the sharpshooter for argument's sake, and then DX feeds in. You can have Hunter take a bump and that sort of a thing to not make it too flat. Take a swing at China and let her fall down, or I don't know if you want to do that or not. I'm trying to think of something. Rick, rude, would slip on his ass or something. Hart, would I have my guys out there? McMahon, I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think DX would be out there either until I think it'd be a run-in type thing. But I'm open to anything. I don't think the WWF would allow, with the magnitude of this match, the way we've got this whole thing written, the situation where it goes, the marks out there are thinking this is going to be a shoot. I want to capitalize on that. I'm not going to work as a commentator so that I'm back here to make sure this match gets in the ring. It adds that in the free-for-all, the pregame show, that's going to be brought out and so forth. Not that Vince is a big deal. I'm just trying to say that all focus is on this match getting in the ring. We'll get a shot of, like, we've got some uniformed. They don't look too menacing, but we've got some uniformed security guys that are going to be hanging around once the show begins. So the idea is we're trying to keep you two away from each other in the locker room because we know that's happened before. We're trying to build that tension all the way through. When you have that in mind, I don't think that the WWF would allow DX to go down with Sean. That would take away from their classic of a match. You have to ultimately have some control of the match. Hart, yeah. All right. Why don't I go find Sean? We'll start working on the match. I think if they do come down, and even though I maybe nail everyone at the end, I think maybe it'll get a pop if I nail China. Especially if it might be the thing to do. It got a pop wherever it was the one time I hit her. But maybe Owen and them could come down after just so they don't look bad. McMahon, whatever. Hart, even if they get there as they're leaving just so they're there. McMahon, whatever you want. Hart, I'll go find Sean and come back, and then I'll come back. McMahon, I put Pat with your match. Patterson was the one who suggested the spot where Michaels would get Hart in the sharpshooter and Hart would reverse, which ended up being the spot where the double cross was pulled. He's the master. Work it through. Hart, okay. It should be mentioned that at no point were voices raised. Even the passages that seemed heated reading them on paper were very soft-spoken on both sides, actually somber and almost apologetic when either on paper appeared to be disagreeing with the other, and even emotional on both sides as they talked about Hart's imminent departure, even if reading the words in spots appeared heated. Hart's reactions were similar to that in the movie, as were McMahon's. In hindsight, it did appear McMahon was having pangs of conscience in the tone of his voice, but that also could have been to disarm Hart. If it was the former, I guess not enough to change his plan. The bottom line is that, despite a lot of what has been said and misinterpreted on this subject, there were no demands made by Hart nor McMahon, or for that matter, even disagreements the day of the show that caused what happened to happen. There were no refusals of any ideas by either side. There was nothing even close to an argument whatsoever of either the finish or any of the other subjects broached that weren't covered in this because they aren't relevant to the story and the finish but were in the conversation. There wasn't a moment that either wasn't cordial in tone, even when both were expressing the tension from the past week from their prior conversations and how the story had gotten out during the week. The true reasons McMahon decided to handle it the way he did are unknown. Those who should have been in the know said afterwards that McMahon was afraid of what Hart might say in a live interview the next night, not that he would say anything bad about WWF, as they all knew he wouldn't, but that he might say something positive about WCW, and get himself over stronger as a babyface in the process while leaving for the opposition. McMahon wasn't happy Hart called WCW an honorable organization in his lengthy interview when he announced he was staying with the WWF for the rest of his life more than 1 year earlier. No doubt the nature of the planned screw, Losing in his own hold in his own country was designed to ruin him in the country where he was the national wrestling hero and a big box office draw, and had nothing to do with the phrase time-honored traditions of the business. Well, actually it did, because in many territories screwing the guy who was leaving the territory was a time-honored tradition that McMahon coined on Raw when trying to give his side of the story without totally exposing what happened. Why he was so vindictive is something we can only speculate on. The cover reason McMahon and his officials were publicly giving, that they were afraid Hart would show up at Nitro the next night in Memphis displaying their belt, as time has gone on, was also proven to not hold any water. Even the fear of Bischoff going on Nitro the next day with the announcement that Hart, the WWF champion, had signed with WCW, which while not completely alleviated, most likely could have been, and was actually addressed by Hart in this conversation. If McMahon who said it wasn't that important because the whole world already knew anyway. When Hart said he'd try to get the announcement delayed if McMahon wanted it that way, it was McMahon who said not to bother. Even then Hart said he still wanted to get the announcement delayed, because he himself wanted to be the first person to publicly state he was leaving the WWF, on Raw, in Ottawa. So whatever the real reason was is something McMahon publicly hasn't wanted to admit. The most recent time he was asked this question publicly, just last week at Oxford University, he dodged the real answer by doing a half-ass version of his heel character and saying that he has balls the size of grapefruits. Was McMahon simply trying to ruin Hart, particularly in Canada, where he'd be WCW's top draw if the company started running regularly in a country McMahon basically has had to himself for more than 14 years? Was he simply trying to gain revenge for Hart so publicly knocking his product and give a message to the boys about speaking out so vehemently against his new direction? Was he mad because Hart had negotiated the reasonable creative control clause into his last 30 days, and more so had the audacity to use it, thereby putting McMahon in the position where legally he didn't have the final say-so in the title match on his own, what turned out to be biggest show of the year, and he just wanted to make some sort of a point? Refusal to do a certain job on a certain day couldn't have been that big a deal, since at the very next pay-per-view, Austin refused to drop the IC title in the ring to Rock on the day requested, or any other day for that matter, and they had to create a scenario where the belt was stripped. A few weeks later, Michaels refused to drop the European title to Owen, and instead handed it over to Hunter, who was supposed to lose it to Owen, although that never happened either. Or was Hart simply an unwitting pawn in McMahon's eyes in his much bigger at the time war with Bischoff, and this was his only way to stick it to Bischoff? The first reason appears to be the one that makes the most sense, but that doesn't mean it's the accurate one. Actually, the last one makes the most business sense, but in hindsight there has been so much personal vindictiveness aimed at Hart after this all went down that this double-cross appears to be more to stick it to Hart than Bischoff. Ironically, with Hart in tow, WCW, as it turns out, didn't even run one show in 1998 in Canada. Even though all this took place 13 months ago, it was the backdrop once again as the WWF came to Vancouver, BC's General Motors Place for the Rock Bottom pay-per-view show on December 13th. The show, which sold out 1 month in advance to the tune of 17,677, announced on TV as 20,042, which was 16,891, paying $416,032 Canadian and another $156,463 Canadian in merchandise, was a pretty bad show for a number of reasons. The finishes were too cute, for the most part leaving the crowd dead. 4 hours continues to be hard to keep a crowd's enthusiasm, and the Undertaker vs. Steve Austin match, which was by far the worst pay-per-view the two have had up to this point, was in spots totally devoid of heat and had a messed up finish, not entirely due to each wrestler's respective health problems going in. The only good match, the Rock vs. Mankind title match, was incredibly devoid of the pre-show storyline psychology and its workings, and while both worked hard and got good pops, the finish was so beyond awful that it pretty well killed the main event that followed. There isn't much good to say about the show other than the WWF is in the position where it can afford a lot of bad pay-per-view shows without being hurt at all. The show opened with Vince McMahon doing an anti-Canadian diatribe, introducing his son Shane as a real American. Dwayne Gill retained the WWF Light Heavyweight title, pinning Matt Hardy in 102 when Blue Meanie did a run-in and delivered a DDT to Hardy. Fans started chanting boring from the moment the bell rang. Hardy took the entire match because the story was that he was going to easily win until the fluke run-in, maintaining the Gill Cinderella story. Finally, Hardy delivered a Splash Mountain, as if Kevin Kelly had a clue what it was, and was going for the victory when Meanie ran in. The Gill gimmick wasn't nearly as over as it should have been. They showed a clip of Mankind attacking Rock before the show started in the luxury boxes and a series of objects, including a plant. Mankind was hilarious as usual, as he nailed him with a plant and called it the people's rhododendron, "Hey, I can't spell plants." He then looked after at the plant and said it wasn't a rhododendron after all. A doctor with a French accent, actually company masseuse François Petty, proclaimed Rock had broken ribs and there was no way he could wrestle later in the show. I must say that's a unique angle to put on a pre-game show when you actually tell the audience the title match promised won't be taking place. B. Kevin Quinn pinned Brian Lawler in 2:23. Quinn, originally from Chicago, has some experience wrestling in Mexico for EMLL. The fans hated him from the start just because they didn't like anyone they didn't know. To make things worse, he missed a lot of spots, although he also did some hot spots. Christopher gave him a sunset flip out of the ring, ending in a power bomb on the floor. Fans booed a mistimed handspring into body squash by Quinn. Christopher lifted Quinn up for a power bomb, and he was supposed to turn it into a Toyota roll, but messed it up completely, but recovered and got a schoolboy for the win. The fans booed the hell out of Quinn's upset win. See Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, pinned Darren Drozdov in 137 with a pedigree. Animal walked out on Droz after the match. The New Age Outlaws, Brian James and Monty Sopp, beat the Acolytes, John Leafield and Ron Simmons, in 2 minutes via DQ when Ken Shamrock and Big Boss Man interfered. Outlaws got out of there and it wound up with the Acolytes fighting with Shamrock and Boss Man as the lights went out and Undertaker made one of those taped eerie speeches just as the live heat was going off the air. 1. Mark Henry and D'Lo Brown, A.C. Connor, beat Godfather, Charles Wright, and Val Venus, Sean Morley, in 5:56. Godfather came out with 4 hoes, who stayed at ringside, while Brown came out with Jacqueline and Terry Runnels on each arm. If the Canadian government swarmed down at ringside and took the women hostage, they'd have enough material to produce several medium-power nuclear missiles. They tried, but it wasn't good. Henry is now being referred to as sexual chocolate. Godfather missed a kick and Brown sold it anyway, eliciting a lot of boos. After Godfather and Venus did a double suplex on Henry, all the women started arguing at ringside and had to be pulled apart. Jacqueline got in the ring and hit Venus with a low blow, and Henry clotheslined him and pinned him after a big splash. 3/4 of a star. 2. Headbangers, Glenn Ruth and Charles Warrington, beat Kurgan, Robert Millay, and Golga, John Tenda, in 6:52. This match changed in form several times over the week. Originally it was to be an 8-man with Giant Silva and Luna on one side and Tiger Ali Singh and Babu on the other. Babu during the week was extradited back to Ecuador for a combination of having to stand trial for crimes in that country, I swear I'm not making this up, and got having a green card to be in this country, so he's done, at least for now. They were planning to have Luna and Tiger Ali still work the match, but for whatever reason, those plans were changed the day of the show. Whatever form it would have taken, it probably would have been awful, but this form saw Kurgan in most of the way. Silva with his new hairdo looks remarkably like Andre, even though the resemblance was always there. Crowd dies for the oddities after the ring entrance. And boy was Kurgan awful. Golga did his first drop kick in the last 5 years. Finish saw Golga attempt to do his earthquake splash on Thrasher, however Mosh had tagged in behind his back, and came off the ropes with a Thez press for the pin. 1 star. 3. Steve Blackman beat Owen Hart via count out in 10:28. Hart got the most enthusiastic babyface reaction on the entire show. But this match killed the show as the crowd really wanted to have fun booing the American, and the match was booked for Hart to play chicken shit heel to turn the crowd, and when they wouldn't turn, they just killed the whole show. Big chance for Owen and US sucks. This was still the second best match on the show as Hart did a great job and Blackman stayed with him. The finish killed it, however. Blackman got Hart in the sharpshooter, which Michael Cole said in something he certainly didn't come up with himself on the spur of the moment, that there's nothing worse than losing to your own hold in your own country. Hart actually made the ropes, which got a big pop from the crowd that desperately didn't want to see that finish. Then Hart simply walked out for the count-out loss, which may have been the only possible finish that would have killed the crowd. Doesn't better about the live crowd and enthusiasm for the show since the whole purpose of the match was to somehow humiliate a guy who wasn't there through his brother. 2.5 stars. 4. The Brood, David Heath and Adam Copeland and Jay Resso, beat Job Squad, Charles Skaggs and Alan Sarvin and Robert Howard, in 9:08. Holly had a new buzz haircut too. He looked like a much larger version of Scott Taylor. Hey, maybe the Job Squad can get married next. Fans were dead. Work was largely good as everyone worked hard. The most impressive was Christian, and he was the one who scored the pin, so there is some justice in wrestling if you look hard enough. Scorpio did some nice flying. A lot of flying toward the finish, so this played a lot like a lucha match would in front of fans that don't want to see lucha. I think part of the problem is the previous finish killed the crowd. As they were building to the finish, Snow went to hit Christian with Mr. N's head and the shot missed, but Christian sold it anyway like he was shot. Lots of groans and boos from the crowd to that. Scorpio did a moonsault leg drop onto Christian, but Edge saved. Edge then leapt off Gangrel's back over the top rope with a crossbody on both Holly and Snow. In the ring, Christian hit the Tommy Rogers Tomahawk, or in Michael Cole vernacular, that move on Scorpio for the pin. 1 1/4 star. 5. Goldust, Dustin Runnels, beat Jeff Jarrett via DQ in 8:02. Actually, this match had a lot of heat, which just shows how much everyone wanted to see Deborah McMichael naked. And because word was out that WWF had Jacqueline topless on its pay-per-view last week, for sure we'd see Deborah naked on this one. I think the only way a match between these two could get over is to promise 17,000 males that they'd see a beauty pageant winner naked at the end. But it was a good match. Goldust used the curtain call. Poor Cole didn't know that one either, on Jarrett, but Deborah distracted the ref. Fans were really into Goldust's near falls. Wonder why? Goldust set up shattered dreams. Deborah got into the ring and started caressing his butt. Of course he didn't care, which I guess proves he was gay all along. Jarrett took the low blow, but Deborah broke the guitar over Goldust's head and Jarrett scored the pin with a reverse Russian leg sweep. Cole didn't know that one either, although saying flatliner could be cause for dismissal from employment. Shawn Michaels came out after the match, and although he plays heel, he said he saw Deborah interfere, reversed the decision, and ordered Deborah to strip. She played it up for all she could. I'm not sure this is what they were teaching here to win all those beauty pageants. Then again, Shawn put a $20 down her top. Not sure if it was an American or Canadian bill, because a Canadian bill would probably have been an insult. She stripped down to a thong bikini underwear. They were very careful to show only shots from the front, teased taking off her top, which she eventually did, but before anything was visible, Jarrett and Blue Blazer covered her up and dragged her away. The WWF hasn't delivered on an advertised stip on a pay-per-view since 1978 to begin with, and the idea anyone is going to see that women with no clothes on for just $29.95 just ain't happening this early in the game. Even so, now Deborah is over like a big dog, although dog is least applicable description. I can just see it in 3 weeks, that Jeff Jarrett is going to have all the charisma in the world in his ring intro. 2.5 stars. 6. Outlaws beat Ken Shamrock and Big Boss Man, Ray Traylor, to retain the WWF tag titles in 1704. These guys were in a bad position. How do you get a crowd interested after seeing a woman strip? Well, whatever it is, these guys didn't have the answer. A long boring match with only Shamrock looking good. Bossman, unfortunately, is still Ray Traylor once the bell rings. Think that's been written in every single match he's worked. They beat up Road Doggy most of the way, until Billy Gunn, the single greatest athlete in all of sports, although I'm still at a loss as to what he's ever done to deserve that. Made the hot tag. After a power bomb delivered off a Hurricane Rana by Ken on Billy, you didn't think Billy was up there doing Hurricane Ranas, did you? And Gunn had the pin. Shawn Michaels pulled ref Tim White out of the ring. Bossman then cracked both Outlaws with his nightstick. But as Shamrock went to pin Gunn, he kicked out. Gunn went to suplex Shamrock into the ring, but Michaels scooped his leg and Shamrock landed on top, but Gunn reversed it into a cradle for the pin. Finish was good. 3/4 star. 7. Mankind beat Rock, but Rock retained the WWF title anyway in 1332. The movie spoofs continued as Mankind had a meeting with Vince earlier in the show, and the door of the boiler room read Mankind's office, a spoof on the sign outside the door when Vince met with Bret where it said Vince's office. Anyway, since Mankind didn't trust Vince, he wanted their business dealings in public before the fans. So when they got in the ring, Mankind demanded that Vince get down on his knees and tell the world that he never submitted at the Survivor Series. Vince wouldn't, claiming Rock told him he heard him say a quit and that was good enough for him. Finally Rock jumped Mankind and we were off. The work itself was real good, but there were parts of the match that were retarded, such as them dropping the entire ribs storyline. After proclaiming Rock with broken ribs, he came out without his ribs taped. The announcers never acknowledged him having broken ribs. He never once sold his ribs and Mankind never once attacked the supposedly injured ribs. It was like halfway through the pay-per-view somebody on the headset said, "That first angle wasn't so hot," and McMahon told everyone, "Let's just pretend it never happened." Something about breaking ribs by hitting them with a plant didn't look that believable in the first place, and God knows that French doctor didn't look like a real doctor, so therefore it never happened. As the match got going, McMahon ordered ref Mike Chioda to DQ Mankind the first chance he got. At one point Mankind was going to jump off the middle ropes outside onto Rock, but Shane McMahon grabbed him by the legs and Rock flipped him off the ropes and he took a big bump on the floor. Mankind sold it like he was dead. They ended up brawling all over the English announcer's position. Mankind went for a chair shot but the Ree stopped him, and Rock DDT'd him on the chair. Rock hit the corporate elbow, which is still a big-time face move that brought the crowd unglued, and Mankind kicked out. Mankind did an elbow drop and leg drop for near falls. McMahon told Chioda to DQ Mankind. Chioda was about to, but Mankind pile drove him. McMahon then ordered Mark Eaton to ring the bell, but Mankind beat up Eaton. Rock nailed him with a chair shot and the rock bottom, but no ref. Shane went to hit Mankind with the title belt, but he moved, and Rock took the blow. Ref Tim White ran in and counted, but Rock kicked out. A hell of a near fall. Rock did a float over DDT for another near fall. Mankind hit a double arm DDT for a near fall. Mankind pulled out Mr. Socko and did the claw and White signaled for the bell. They announced Mankind winner and new champion, but McMahon then said that since Rock wasn't pinned and he didn't submit, that even though Mankind won the match, Rock was still the champ. Mankind went wild, beating up Vince, including the Mr. Socko claw Shane, after Shane hit Mankind with 2 chair shots he didn't sell, Pat Patterson and Gerald Briscoe before finally Shamrock and Bossman showed up. 3¼ stars. 8. Steve Austin Steve Williams beat Undertaker, Mark Calloway, in the Buried Alive match in 21:30. This was one of those deals where anything that could go wrong did. Undertaker is already limited as he's been working for months without a rest on a broken ankle. Austin was suffering from an intestinal virus and had barely eaten the previous week. To make things worse, early in the match he took a bump on the uneven dirt mound on his shoulder which tore his oblique or abdominal muscle on the right side. He worked the rest of the match with a feeling of being stabbed in the side every time he moved his torso, and went to the hospital after the match and actually missed the television tapings, which says something since he made TV the day after being dropped on his head by Owen Hart. So he was not himself, particularly as the match progressed. The crowd, hurt by the previous finish, was totally dead, to the point in spots that you actually thought they had turned off the crowd audio, which was positively eerie when Austin was in the ring. They did some decent brawling early outside the ring. They brawled a lot around the gravesite. At one point Undertaker took a bump sliding down the mound of dirt. They were fighting at the gravesite and Undertaker fell into the grave, but got out and hit Austin with a burial wreath. Both wound up in the grave, but both got out, but not before Austin teased but didn't deliver a shovel shot. By this point the illness and injury appeared to be really taking its toll, as Austin was moving without his usual snap, and his punches were becoming Hogan-like. Taker cracked him in the head with a chair and slammed his back into the post, and finally hit a choke slam. Taker took him in the grave site and threw him into the grave. A cup hit Undertaker which got more of a pop than anything the two wrestlers had done up to this point. Taker started shoveling dirt nowhere near Austin in the grave, which looked bad on camera. Austin got out and hit Taker twice with an oil can. Austin used the stunner and threw Taker into the grave, and left to chase Paul Bearer. Taker sat up and got out. There was a big explosion coming from the grave and out came Kane. Kane came out of the grave, and with those 3-inch heels to make him look 6'11", he was slipping all over the dirt, not able to keep any footing. Taker low-blowed him and went for the tombstone, but Kane got away and delivered a tombstone and threw Taker back in the grave. Austin came out with a bulldozer. Somehow the bulldozer got stage fright and couldn't perform. Maybe they should have had Deborah strip for it. Anyway, while time stood still and Austin was looking totally PO'd, Austin started shoveling dirt into the grave. The bulldozer eventually dumped one load of dirt into the grave, then didn't do a thing again for what seemed like an eternity. This whole scene was dead and took forever. Earl Hebner, I guess getting tired of waiting for a pop that wasn't going to come, raised Austin's hand and the two shared another couple of beers. 3/4 star. In what reports are claiming was arguably the greatest K1 show to date, Peter Aerts, 28, captured the 6th annual World Grand Prix Championship in the 8-man tournament on December 13 before a sellout 63,800 fans at the Tokyo Dome, sold out well in advance, except for 3,000 standing room tickets put on sale the morning of the show, which were gobbled up immediately, and believed to be the largest audience and record gate for any kickboxing event ever in Japan and without question for revenue generated, the rest of the world. The show also drew a 15.8 rating on the Fuji network, a number described as very good for a primetime Sunday night broadcast, but well below the network projections of a 20. Last year's Grand Prix tournament drew a 20.7, ranking it number 10 in that week's primetime television ratings in Japan. On September 27, the first round of this year's Grand Prix tournament drew a 17.7, so the first round matches actually outdrew the finals. It was the third tournament win for Aerts, having previously won in 1994 and 1995. After the show, Aerts credited his win partially to cutting back on his extracurricular activities, and the Holland native was a noted partier, and some felt that led to his decline from a few years back where he was largely considered as the best heavyweight Muay Thai kickboxer on the planet. Aerts claimed to have given up drinking and smoking, and this led to his being in better condition. Aerts defeated 1996 champion Andy Hug with a high kick to the back of the head knockout in just 1:10 in the championship match. Hug, 34, the most popular name in K1, was said to have appeared to be past his prime in the tournament, and the feeling is that K1 needs to produce a new star to replace him as the top draw. Aerts went into the final fresher than Hug, having fought a total of 5:33 in a pair of first-round knockouts over Masaki Sadake and Mike Bernardo. Hug fought 14:28, with a 2:28 of the second-round TKO over Ray Sefo with a right straight punch, and a 3-round majority decision over Sam Greco. Earlier, Greco had upset defending champion Ernesto Hoost when the match was stopped after the completion of the second round due to a dangerous cut above the eye. First-round results saw Bernardo beating Francisco Filio in 1:35 of the third round with a right hook, Aerts over Sadake, Greco over Hoost, and Hug over Sefo. Michael Buffer worked the show as the ring announcer, which explained why he wasn't at the live Nitro in Tampa the next day. After the show, K1 president Kazuyoshi Ishii said that next year's K1 Grand Prix finals would air live around the world on pay-per-view. Plans to put this show on pay-per-view in the United States fell apart because it was scheduled the same day as the WWF's Rock Bottom pay-per-view show. Ishii had already announced that next year's Grand Prix would be a 32-man tournament, consisting of 8 first-round matches in July at the Nagoya Dome, 8 first-round matches in August at the Fukuoka Dome, 8 second-round matches in October at the Osaka Dome, building to the final 8 competitors going to the big tournament once again in December at the Tokyo Dome. K1, which drew a sellout crowd of 4,250 and $300,000 live gate for its U.S. debut for a show at the Mirage Hotel in Las Vegas, but did poorly on pay-per-view, doing about a 0.1 buy rate, has postponed its original plans for a return shot in February. The current plans appear to be a return pay-per-view and live show from Las Vegas in May, along with major shows in June in Switzerland, and debuting in 1999 in Australia as well. Ishii also announced that he was looking for more involvement from pro wrestlers in 1999. This past year, pro wrestler Yoji Anjo, along with former pro wrestlers Bart Vale and Mitsuya Nagai, all competed in K1 under kickboxing rules and all got knocked out. Naoya Ogawa did more, along with lines of worked UFC-style matches, once with Anjo and another against a non-pro wrestler. The current direction of the WWF with the recent Crucifixion Angle has again raised the question of how far is too far when it comes to pro wrestling angles. There are simple answers to this question. If the product was aimed only at adults, too far is when it negatively affects business. Too far is when more people are turned off than turned on by the angles, and that shows when the ratings begin to drop. Clearly that hasn't happened yet, and WWF is still on the ascension both in ratings and attendance. Too far is when the TV stations get so much heat they threaten to drop the product unless things cool down. Clearly that hasn't happened either, at least as it pertains to the USA Network, as Canada's TSN did edit the entire angle off its version of Raw. When it comes to taste, I respect everyone's sincere religious beliefs and recognize this angle offended people. In my mind, the angle was more elaborately done, but in what it was trying to portray, no different than almost a duplicate angle that aired on both the previous 2 Mondays on the Galavision Lucha Lunes show on Televisa, the highest-rated station in Mexico, neither stations of which edited it off the show nor received any significant protest to it in a heavily religious Catholic country. While there were religious organizations upset by the WWF angle, there was no sizable backlash, although there were people who clearly were offended. WWF treads in weird water because it markets and draws so heavily to very young children, but for whatever reason, that hasn't proven to have been a factor in its programming or in garnering much of a significant reaction to the direction. I've been more amazed at the current angles as opposed to being offended. The angle where Steve Austin held a gun to Vince McMahon's head I felt was really sad because it involved thousands of fans cheering for one man to literally blow the brains out of another, and glorified kidnapping and taking someone hostage, although that's a lot more abstract glorification for kids than many things that occur on wrestling that kids really can copy. For whatever reason, perhaps because of the makeup of where I live, I was offended seeing Kaz Hayashi portrayed as a retarded child stumbling around with his Japanese-English dictionary, although that was no different than 24-year-old Taka Michinoku being portrayed as a 14-year-old behind the schoolyard who doesn't know how to either smoke or drive a car. Both the Hawk and Scott Hall angles were in terribly poor taste. The Hall angle, because even though both angles were a play off reality, Hall's reality was a little too public and too real and was one of the worst taste angles of a year of bad taste angles. But the Hall angle got a lot of heat and was dropped pretty quickly, whereas the Hawk angle has gone on for a long time. I thought the embalming angle was totally stupid and unbelievable, but not the least bit offensive. But everyone can make their own taste and judgment decisions, and just as WWF has the right to air what it does as long as the TV station will allow it, people who are offended have the right to be offended, and if negative publicity results, so be it. The fact so many children are watching makes this a potential powder keg. The WWF wants the bad pub, and just like the lessons of UFC, and for that matter the WWF already went through this story in 1992 with apparently little being learned by the first fall, have shown, negative publicity can be good for business, until it isn't good for business. And when it no longer becomes great, it's hard to turn things around. This game may be the most interesting one of 1999. The tumultuous world of Mexican wrestling, politics, and how it affects the US scene took another turn for the weird this past week. Nobody seems to have a clear idea of exactly what the relationship is involving Paco Alonso and WCW, as after a deal had been agreed to, WCW hasn't signed it. Due to the strong ratings the WWF Super Astros has been doing on Univision in most markets, almost record ratings this week. Although there are reasons having nothing to do with the show for that, Telemundo, their rival, is back interested in working with WCW for a one-hour weekly show after Telemundo had dropped the idea a few months back because of not wanting to build its show around performers that were appearing, but not as stars, on TNT and TBS. While nothing is finalized, as all this really has just come about in the past few days, it is believed the WCW product will differ from the WWF product in several ways. The WWF product isn't meant to be lucha libre, but instead WWF wrestling using smaller wrestlers who can speak Spanish from either Mexico or Puerto Rico. The WCW product will be a more Mexican-oriented product with slightly longer matches, trios matches, and more of a Latin flavor using masked wrestlers, and being taped separately with a Latin audience using Conan as the booker and with Sonny Wanu in charge of the business end. The first two tapings planned are for January 27th in Huntsville, Texas and February 25th in San Angelo, Texas, but this will really test the promotion because WCW has been unsuccessful to this point in attracting an Hispanic audience, and really, with the exception of Los Angeles, San Jose and Watsonville, California and Chicago, and to a lesser extent Houston, there haven't been any markets where lucha libre style has been any kind of a success in this country during this decade. The show at present has no planned name. Where this gets tricky is that Telemundo, Univision and Galavision are all competitors for the Spanish-speaking audience. Alonso's weekly big shows at Arena Mexico air on Galavision, but neither Telemundo nor Univision would be happy about the wrestlers they are featuring also airing on Galavision. Thus far, many of the top Univision WWF stars like Negro Casas, El Hijo del Santo and Apollo Dantes are still appearing at Arena Mexico and on Galavision, although it's questionable if that will continue in 1999. And with WCW wrestlers working Arena Mexico as well, and both on December 4th and December 11th, and upcoming on December 18th, WCW wrestlers will wrestling WWF wrestlers on a show that airs in the United States, which I know WWF isn't fond of and doubt WCW would be either. It would create that problem for Telemundo. Expect more repercussions from all this over the next 2 weeks. On the EMLL Year-End Spectacular, there is a match billed as WWF vs WCW with Silver King and Villanos Tercero and 5 vs Felino and Casas and Santo, a rematch from the December 11th Trios Tournament match which the WWF team won. King and Villano V are the only WCW wrestlers appearing on the year-end show, as Vampiro walked out when informed he wouldn't be winning the CMLL heavyweight title from Rayo de Jalisco Jr. as the main event on that card. The WWF's Super Astros drew record ratings on December 13th, but that was more because the show was a lead-in in some time zones for the Mexican League Soccer Championship game, and immediately followed the game, which aired live, on the West Coast. The soccer game drew a 28.0 Hispanic rating in the Los Angeles market, and Super Astros, which followed, did a 14.0 rating. However, that 14 rating is misleading, as the first 15 minutes, which came right after soccer and featured Santo, drew a 21.0, and the next 15 minutes, with Casas vs. Dantes, drew a 7.0. With the exception of Miami, where the Spanish audience isn't primarily Mexican and thus the Mexican League Championship game wouldn't be that huge a draw, Super Astros also did record numbers with a 16.6 in Chicago, an 8.1 in New York, a 6.9 in San Antonio, and a 3.7 in Miami. The December 14th ratings war, despite a heart attack angle involving Ric Flair, was more of the same. It was clear that literally nobody, well, I'm sure somebody, but clearly they were a statistically insignificant percentage, bought the Flair angle as a shoot because the ratings were almost identical to the past several weeks, with Raw winning for the 7th week in a row. Whether Flair, who has been bulletproof and has gotten stronger as a character historically, the harder companies attempted to bury him, will be hurt by this portrayal of him as a performer so old he no longer belongs in the ring, in a business where youth and being new is at a premium to a younger audience, is a risk. But the angle is designed to give the exact opposite end result. This is supposed to wind up with a huge angle on December 28th in Baltimore to somehow revitalize Flair and make him bigger than ever, and it will be revealed probably before you read this that he didn't really suffer a heart attack. To show the concern and belief, the WCW rating for the actual Bischoff and Flair interview was a 5.9 going unopposed, which was a tremendous number. The next quarter, after the heart attack angle, when if people believed it, they should be curious, dropped to a 3.7. WCW always drops huge when Raw goes on the air, but a 2.2 ratings point drop is actually unprecedented. WCW hovered in the 3.7 to 4.2 range the rest of the show, and actually dropped again in ratings after a somber Bischoff announced Flair had suffered a mild heart attack. The heart attack angle wasn't what had been planned originally for the show and was a change in the planned storyline leading to Starrcade. The new booking team apparently came up with the idea when on the way to Tampa hearing the news about Dan Reeves, who had a bypass heart operation, and it was an idea stemming from that to be topical. If there was good news for WCW, it was that with both Steve Austin and Undertaker out of the picture, the overrun main event comparison saw WWF's Rock vs. Triple H title match do a 5.01, while WCW's three-way with Goldberg, Nash and Bigelow did a 4.86, which at least was close. WWF won all 8 quarters easily en route to an overall 5.16 rating, 5.30 first hour, 5.10 seconds hour, and 7.9 share. WCW drew a 4.23 rating, 4.77 first hour, 3.90 seconds hour, 4.03 third hour, with a 6.4 share. The head-to-head comparison was a 5.16 to a 3.97. In head-to-head 2 hours and 5-minute comparisons, Raw drew 5,735,000 viewers to Nitro's 4,414,000. In the various demo breakdowns, for 18 to 24 males it is Raw with 388,000 and Nitro with 321,000. For 25 to 54 males it is Raw with 1,743,000 to Nitro's 1,326,000. For 55 plus males it is Raw with 447,000 to Nitro's 439,000. For 18 to 24 females, it is Nitro with 300,000 to Raw's 275,000. For 25 to 54 females it is Raw with 928,000 to Nitro's 683,000. For 55 plus females it is Nitro with 306,000 to Raw's 170,000. For kids 2 to 11, it is Raw with 650,000 to Nitro's 558,000. For teenagers it is Raw with 1,134,000 to Nitro at 482,000. The quarter hours really don't tell much of a story as Raw dominated and the overrun was the only period that was close. The biggest gap was in the first quarter when Raw had the DX spoof on the corporation doing a 5.5 to WCW's 3.7 for Kidman vs. Mysterio Jr. The closest Nitro came was in the 6th quarter with a 4.1 for interviews with Bischoff and the Stevie Ray Booker T confrontation to Raw's 4.8 for Jarrett vs. Blackman. So even with Deborah stripping, Jarrett still dropped Raw's rating another half point. Nitro's actual peak was a 4.2 for the Jericho skit and Kidman vs. Mysterio Jr. was its low. Raw's peak was the DX skit and its low point was Jarrett vs. Blackman. Japanese television rundown. November 20th rings. 1. Lee Hasdell drew Yasuhito Namikawa after 15 minutes with no points scored. This was a shoot match with some decent standing exchanges. It slowed down as it went on. Namikawa controlled most of the match, but got tired at the end and Hasdell was pounding on him toward the finish. Hasdell was cut under his eye. A draw was the fair decision. 2. The team from Georgia, as in the Soviet Georgia, beat Australia in the World Mega Battle Tournament first round. These tournament matches are all worked. It started with Backstage's Terriel putting Daniel Higgins in a front guillotine in only 21 seconds. Terriel weighed in at 319 and Higgins was 195, so you can imagine what this looked like and why it lasted so short. Terriel then knocked down Troy Ittensone at 198 pounds twice in 42 seconds. This left 209-pound Christopher Haseman by himself, and he scored the biggest upset in the history of the promotion in 157 with a tap out from a choke. Haseman's head was busted open as the two were really trading good shots. It was real good for what it was. This put Haseman against Backstage's Amaran, who was like 6'7.5" and 292 pounds. Amaran lost the first point from a yellow card. Haseman scored a takedown, but Amaran made this really cool escape and rolled into a guillotine for a rope escape point. Amaran then scored a knockdown at 132 to end the game, set it match. Haseman once again proved to be one of the most underrated workers in the business here. 3. Hiromitsu Kanehara beat Dave Van de Veen in 7:29. Van de Veen is a powerlifting champion from Holland who proved to be a pretty good striker. This was a shoot and a pretty good shoot match. Even though Kanehara is far more experienced, he ended up respecting Van de Veen's stand-up fighting. They traded a lot of blows standing before Kanehara got the messages to take him down. Kanehara wasn't fooling around as he would throw a lot of blows from the mount to try and force Van de Veen to move into a submission. Whenever Van de Veen would escape, he'd back off and stand up, figuring it was to his advantage. Finally, after a takedown, Kanehara maneuvered him into a shoulder lock. 4. The Russian B team beat Japan B in the tournament. It started with Masayuki Naruse beating Vladimir Klementiev. This was kind of weak as Klementiev grabbed the ropes when Naruse got behind him to lose his first point, even though Naruse hadn't even started going for a submission. Klementiev, who was way taller, used his reach for a knockdown. Naruse again got his back and Klementiev simply rolled to the ropes, but since 2 points are out in the tournament, that was the end of the match in 2:16. Finish was real weak. Andrei Kopylov then beat Naruse in 2:32 after an armbar after scoring his first point in about 40 seconds with an armbar. Not much to this. Kiyoshi Tamura beat Kopylov in 1:35. Kopylov got an armbar right away and Tamura made the ropes, but it told the story that Tamura was injured in the arm. Tamura, who was outweighed by 82 pounds, came back with a knee bar for a rope break point. The end got funny as Kopylov lost his footing from a stiff low kick, but since that wasn't the finish, it was ruled a slip. Tamura then kicked the hell out of him high, and since that wasn't the finish, Kopylov didn't go down, although I have no clue as to how he didn't. Finally, Tamura got the armbar. Tamura was pretty much a miracle worker in this match. Nikolai Zuev beat Tamura in 3:17. Really good mat work. Tamura was totally carrying things, but Zuev is good enough to hang and be believable. Zuev scored the first point with an ankle lock and rope break. Tamura kicked Zuev hard in the head and he stayed up, and this was even more impressive than Kopylov not going down. Tamura then got an armbar for a rope break point. Finally, Zuev got the armbar on the arm that Tamura had been selling since Kopylov damaged him, and he immediately tapped. Tamura was real good and the match told a good story. This left Zuev versus Tsuyoshi Kosaka. This was an amazing performance by Kosaka, as he carried Zuev for 10 minutes in a match that on its own would have to have been 3.25 stars. It was even more impressive given that it was all mat work, and each could only get one rope break point, so you could only do 2 false finishes. Kosaka just rolled from move into move, and did nothing short of a brilliant job of carrying the match. Kosaka basically dominated the entire match since he was the only one who had a clue how to do this style of match without winning. Zuev got his point with a knee bar and Kosaka got his at 7:12 with an ankle lock. The final 3 minutes saw Kosaka nearly get one move after another. For whatever reason, and with the final match being a draw, they went to the judges to pick the winning team and they picked Russia, probably because when you add up the points, Russia won 7-6, because Kosaka controlled the last match basically from start to finish. Flat ending to a good series of matches. December 6th, All Japan. 1. Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama beat Stan Hansen and Vader in the Real World Tag League Finals in 1903. It started out real hot as the Japanese sold great to make Vader appear to be a monster. A lot of credit should go to Kobashi and Akiyama, because Hansen is done, but somehow this was a real good match anyway. Hansen and Vader were on offense almost the entire way to keep them as the monster team even though they were doing the job. Vader did a German suplex on Akiyama, very similar to the move he did at the Tokyo Dome to Antonio Inoki, and there was a big pop for the kick out. Akiyama also kicked out of a lariat. The match slowed down as they were pounding on Akiyama. Finally he made the hot tag to Kobashi, who started working on Vader's knees including a dragon screw. Vader came back with a splash but Kobashi kicked out. Vader did a splash off the middle ropes which they called the Big Van Crush, but Akiyama saved. Outside the ring the two went after Akiyama, with Hansen giving him a DDT on the floor. Kobashi worked the next few minutes on his own selling. They were supposed to do a stuff power bomb, but Hansen basically missed the stuffs, so it was just a power bomb for a near fall. Hansen set for the lariat, but just then Akiyama came to life with a knee to the back off the top, which stunned Hansen, and Kobashi lariated him for the pin. It was circa 1985 as Vader and Hansen lariated both guys after the match and left them laying 3 3/4 stars. 2. Mitsuharu Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Masahito Kakihara beat Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue and Yoshihiro Takayama in 17:11. The last 6 minutes aired. Misawa and Kawada worked real hard carrying things, particularly Misawa looked real good. Kakihara looked great as well, but they've got him categorized now as a junior heavyweight, and judging by weight he is. But you know what this means in this company as far as a push. Misawa and Ogawa did a double-team Tiger Driver on Takayama, who got a big pop for kicking out. Misawa then nailed him with an elbow to the face and got the pin. Finish was a little anticlimactic as Takayama kicked out of a move the fans thought was it, then stayed down for a move they thought wasn't it. Kakihara was really berating Takayama for not picking him as his tag partner during the tournament after the match. 3 1/4 stars. Mexico. Fuerza and Juventud Guerrera were both fined and put on probation by the DF Commission for the brawl in the stands on the December 4 Arena Mexico show. The amount of the fine wasn't released. The commission stated if they got into another fight with fans that both of their licenses would be revoked. The commission did rule that the fight was instigated by Leonardo Mario Riaño, the 15-year-old son of an editor at a major Mexico City newspaper and nephew of a television announcer. Riaño, attending with many of his high school friends, hit Fuerza Guerrera in the back of the head with a Pepsi bottle, a famous Mexican wrestling angle from a few years back involving Pero Aguayo that drew incredible money, and he was bleeding pretty bad. Fuerza, who is 44 and even though he's a little guy, he has a very imposing demeanor and a reputation going way back in Mexico as being someone that you know not to mess with, jumped into the stands and started fighting, which caused all of Riaño's friends to jump him, and Juventud jumped into the stands to protect his father. Several commission members quickly jumped in and tried to break things up. The commission ruled that even though the fans started it and that Juventud was just protecting his father, it cannot condone wrestlers fighting in the stands, stating that is what ringside security is for. It appears with all the problems, that the Vampiro vs. Rayo de Jalisco Jr. title change scheduled for December 18th is out the window. At press time, we don't have the lineup for next week. With all the uncertainty about WCW, Vampiro was told the December 18th match would be non-title. The angle between the two in the ring was booed heavily and didn't get over as Vampiro left Mexico and appears to be done again. The main event saw Rayo and Dandy and Hector Garza beat Vampiro and Fuerza and Juventud Guerrera via DQ when Vampiro gave Rayo a low blow. The match was said to have been a mess and Vampiro and Rayo didn't work well together. Dandy didn't want to make any big moves and Juventud tried to do every move he knows in his first match ever at the Cathedral of Mexican Wrestling. Dr. Wagner Jr. and Blue Panther and Black Warrior captured their trios tournament on December 11th, so on December 18th, they faced Zumbido and Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. for the vacant CMLL Trios title in the final. The December 11th tournament included a WCW team versus a WWF team, with the WWF team winning as Santo and Negro Casas and Felino beat Villanos Tercero and Ivan Silver King, which was said to have been the best and most heated match on the card. Not sure who pinned who in the match. This put Santos' team into the tournament final against Wagner's team, ending when Wagner used a Michinoku Driver 2 on Casas for the pin and stretcher job. At the same time, Warrior used a Hurricane Rana to pin Felino. After the match, Santos started shoving Felino, claiming the Casas brothers didn't hold up their end of the team by both losing. Besides the six-man title and the WWF vs. WCW match, the December 18th year-end spectacular has Los Hermanos Dinamita vs. Rayo and Team Nieblas Jr. and Salmon Grundy, Karloff Lagarde Jr. and Mano Negra Sr. and Shu El Guerrero vs. Mascara Magica and Super Kendo and Solar and Minis in the opener. Actually, the biggest news on the December 11th show happened before it ever took place, an attack on television announcer Dr. Alfonso Morales. A mugger dressed up like a police officer attacked him, who fought back, and it was quickly broken up, but it got a lot of attention being that Morales is a major well-known celebrity. The crime rate near Arena, Mexico, and in Mexico City in general, to the point tourists from America are basically warned not to go, and particularly not to walk the streets on Friday or Saturday night, is horrible, as in the story in Ovaciones. They reported that not only Morales, but also they've had a reporter and a photographer in recent weeks near the building mugged, and this has hurt attendance. Morales, in his column on December 15th, played down the story, saying he's someone who is in the public eye, and because of that the story was blown out of proportion. He said he felt sorry for the reporter and photographer mugged in recent weeks because both were smaller men. Morales is a very large man for a Mexican, and were attacked for no reason. Ovaciones reported that Antonio Pena is attempting to sign a deal with either WWF or ECW. The story claimed that Pena has a meeting scheduled with Bruce Pritchard and Victor Quiñones of WWF, and also claims a December 20th meeting with Paul Heyman. At a TV taping for ESPN International on December 13th in Naucalpan, which was also attended by a Japanese touring group promoted by Weekly Pro Wrestling magazine, Shima Nobunaga captured the IWRG middleweight title, beating Dr. Cerebro. The main event on the show saw Mika Segura win a bloody hair versus hair match in 35 minutes over Starboy. Olympico beat Halcón Negro Jr. on December 13th in Guadalajara to regain the CMLL welterweight title. AAA appears to be building to a Latin Lover vs. Cobarde hair match this coming week. La Fiera cracked 2 cervical vertebras and will be out of action longer than expected. For whatever this is worth, the cover of this week's Super Luchas lists Santo and Austin as the 2 biggest wrestling stars in the world. Box E Lucha magazine did a story on the inventing of the Michinoku Driver 2, claiming the hold was first used by Billy Robinson in a 1977 match with Jumbo Tsuruta. El Hijo del Solitario jumped from EMLL to AAA. Jorge Rojas, who headed the defunct Promo Azteca, is trying to open up a new office and trying to lure Cibernetico from AAA to be his top star. All Japan. Giant Baba, 60, cancelled his planned trip to Vancouver for the WWF pay-per-view show, and at press time was hospitalized with what has been described as a relapse of a bad cold. This comes just a few days after his rare missing of 2 house shows. A match has been added on the next tour on January 7th in Kochi, with Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue defending the tag titles against Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama. Nikon Sports came out with their awards on December 16th, and again All Japan dominated. Kobashi was named MVP. Keiji Muto was named Most Outstanding. Akiyama received the Fighting Spirit, Hardest Worker award. Naoya Ogawa got Best Technical Wrestler, which is a joke, and the October 31st Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Kobashi match was named Match of the Year. The December 27th television show, which will cover the entire tag team tournament in highlight form, has been expanded from 30 minutes to 60 minutes, furthering rumors that next season the TV show will be lengthened on a regular basis. November 29th TV did a 4.0 rating. New Japan. They are doing an angle for the top 3 matches at the Tokyo Dome, where Satoru Sayama has asked for no rules at all, with even biting, eye gouging and low blows legal, for the Shinya Hashimoto vs. Naoya Ogawa, Don Fry vs. Brian Johnston and Yuji Nagata vs. Dave Beneteau matches. New Japan had not agreed to those stiffs. UFO finally did announce its December 30th Osaka Castle Hall show, largely filled with no names, and they are going to have to paper this building like crazy to give the guys of a flourishing rival promotion. Top 2 matches in Osaka are Ogawa vs. Gerard Gordeau, whose main claim to fame was losing to Royce Gracie in the first ever UFC Tournament Championship, and Fry vs. Murakami Kazunari, whose main claim to fame was being the victim of the single greatest punch in American MMA pay-per-view competition thrown by Maurice Smith in an EFC Championship match. Actually, the most interesting match from an intrigue standpoint has Alexander Otska, coming off the Marco Ruiz win against Sayama, wearing his tiger mask, and pro wrestler Ikuto Hidaka vs. Orlando Vite, plus matches with a 4th tiger mask, Michinoku Pro, Beneteau, Johnston, and Russian Igor Mindert. In last week's Asian Games, there was a heavyweight judo player from China named Pan Sun, 6'10.5" and 308 pounds, who captured the bronze medal and is training for the Sydney Olympics. Due to his size and being Chinese, and apparently having a great facial resemblance to Baba, Antonio Inoki was very interested in recruiting him for pro wrestling. November 28, TV did a 2.6 rating. Other Japan notes. Several New Japan wrestlers worked War's biggest show of the year on December 11 at Tokyo's Komazawa Olympic Park Gym, which drew only 2,440. IWGP Tag Champs Genichiro Tenryu and Shiro Koshinaka won what turned out to be a non-title match over Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki in 13:49 when Tenryu pinned Yamazaki. After the match, Shoji Nakamaki, who recently left Big Japan and appeared on the FMW pay-per-view show in Mr. Pogo's Corner, came to ringside and asked to join War, and Tenryu agreed to form a tag team with Nakamaki on a January 15 War show at Korakuen Hall. Nakamaki did an angle attacking Nobutaka Araya as well. Also, IWGP Junior Tag Champs Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani added a second title, the International Junior Tag title, beating Masao Orihara and Masaaki Mochizuki in a match to determine the vacant champs in 15:57. In other New Japan-related news, Jushin Liger worked the Michinoku show on December 13 in Osaka before 1,570 teaming with Great Sasuke to loss to Grand Naniwa and Super Delphin, when Delphin pinned Sasuke. Liger asked for Delphin to start working New Japan big shows next year, including trying to get him into the Tokyo Dome show. Delphin had worked several indie dates last year with All Japan, and they wanted him to work even more for them next year. Uso and FMW ran 3 straight shows at Korakuen Hall from December 11 to December 13, the latter of which took place just before the start of the K1 Grand Prix at the Tokyo Dome, and the latter 2 shows with ECW talent. Korakuen Hall is about 100 yards from Korakuen Hall, and with half of Japan waiting for that show, the Korakuen Mall was said to be an absolute zoo all day. The Uso show on December 11 was said to have been terrible, featuring several former FMW stars that had retired, such as Katsuji Ueda, Samba Asako, Keiko Iwam, and Combat Toyota. The actual main draw was a ceremony for the official retirement of the Sheik. Sheik, who on a worldwide basis was probably the #1 heel in the pro wrestling world during the 70s, came out with Sabu and ran around the building throwing furniture, which was his trademark Japanese ring entrance. Sheik threw some fire and chased some photographers with a big sword. Many newspapers and magazines presented Sheik with awards, as did Atsushi Onita. Sheik said that both Onita and Sabu were Ichiban, which sounds like a disease but actually means they are #1. Backstage, Sheik could barely move due to his bad knees and hips from all the years of punishment, but once before the crowd, he had some spring in his step which made everyone happy, and the fans who were there mainly to see him would have overlooked limping anyway. The shows with ECW were said to have been a lot better. The ECW wrestlers were more over and wrestled better than the FMW wrestlers. December 12 saw Bubba Ray and Devon Dudley over Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Gasaku, Shane Douglas retaining the ECW title, beating Gedo in 12:25, and Sabu and Rob Van Dam over Hayabusa and Tommy Dreamer in 17:27. They also had more tournament matches to determine the #1 contender for Hiromichi Fuyuki's double world title, with Haido over Takeshi Ono, Masao Orihara pinning Riki Fuji, Yukihiro Kanemura pinning Hideki Hasaka, and Mr. Ganasuke beating Koji Nakagawa. December 13 saw the quarterfinals and semifinals of the tournament, plus the ECW tag title change. Sabu and Van Dam beat Dudleys in 16:59 when Sabu pinned Devon in a match with a lot of missed moves, but the crowd enjoyed it anyway. Douglas retained the ECW title, beating Dreamer in what was described as a professional match in 12:08. Tournament quarterfinals had Kuroda over Muhammad Yone, Haido over Orihara via DQ, Ganasuke over Kanemura, and Hisakatsu Oya upset Hayabusa. Semifinals had Ganasuke over Haido and Oya over Kuroda, to set up Ganasuke vs. Oya for the tournament final on January 5 at Korakuen Hall, with the winner getting the title shot on January 6 at Korakuen Hall. Pancrase has released a statement saying that in 1999 it is going to be more focused on having its fighters compete under Vale Tudo rules and in interpromotional matches. The December 19 pay-per-view show, which features 3 Vale Tudo rules fights including Masakatsu Funaki's debut under those rules, will not be an aberration. They also said they would have matches next year against competitors from Shudo and from the Takata Dojo. Rings contacted Frank Shamrock about doing a match against Kiyoshi Tamura, most likely for the February 21 Yokohama Arena show as the semifinal for the Akira Maeda vs. Alexander Karelin match. Maeda returned from Russia on December 16 after meeting with Karelin and said the two were unable to come to an agreement regarding the rules for their match. He said that Karelin would come to Japan in January, so he may do a tune-up match on the January 23 Budokan Hall show to further their rules negotiations. Urshan's Mariko Yoshida was married on November 22. It is very rare for Japanese women wrestlers to get married until after they retire, and often they retire specifically because they choose to get married. There has been some media pub this last week over the wedding of former AJW star Mitsuko Nishiwaki, who was actually the top babyface during one of the real down periods about 8 years ago, to a sumo wrestler named KO. Dynamite Kansai is out of action for the rest of the year, so Cuddy Suzuki's retirement match on December 27th will have to have a new opponent. Hikari Fukuoka returns to JWP on December 15th after being out a while due to a serious neck injury. Saw a tape of the Big Battle Aerts November 23rd Sumo Hall show. It was a good show for what it was, which was total nostalgia night. But for wrestling it was terrible. Bob Backlund vs. Great Sasuke saw every spot miss bad. Poor Sasuke did all his flying and Backlund was always in the wrong place outside the ring and didn't catch him on any dives due to wrong positioning and not plans for missed dives. Backlund actually missed just about every spot in the match. If the moves weren't so high risk and Sasuke wasn't hurting himself, it actually would have been funny. Road Warriors vs. Alexander Otsuka and Muhammad Yone was an attempt to do a 4 minutes Road Warriors match from the 80s with the Japanese guys just bumping. Except Hawk in particular had his timing so far off. Otsuka tried this running flip dive over the post and Hawk was way out there and didn't catch him either. Otsuka tried a giant swing on Animal, and since Animal had never taken one before and Otsuka is used to doing it on guys who are probably 80 pounds lighter, he could barely get him off the ground, which also wasn't a sell. Finally, Backlund vs. Yuki Ishikawa was funny only because Ishikawa spent the match as Inoki to reprise the famous Inoki-Backlund feud that he, and most of the fans in attendance, grew up on, as the fans knew every spot. As a current match it was terrible, but I think the audience enjoyed the show as nostalgia from their youth. Here and there. St. Martin's Press is working on a biography of Jesse Ventura, which makes the second book that we know of in production. As it regards the death of legendary boxer Archie Moore this past week at the age of 84, there was a noted pro wrestling connection. Moore, who had more sanctioned knockout wins than any man in history, had his final knockout win in the record books in Amarillo, Texas against a man by the name of Mike DiBiase in 1963. I was always under the impression that was a pro wrestling deal and angle. Mike was a great pro and amateur wrestler in his day and the stepfather of Ted DiBiase. Moore also did a famous pro wrestling angle with the Shire brothers, one of whom later became more famous as Ray Stevens, in Georgia in the late 50s, leading to a boxer versus wrestler match against Roy that was a real big deal at the time. After their angle, Moore and Roy Shire maintained a relationship, and I can recall as late as 1972 seeing Moore brought in as a special referee at the Cow Palace doing the one-punch deal that the boxers, as refs, used to do with Lars Anderson. Memphis on December 12 was a show-long angle built around Randy Hale's birthday. Dave Brown continually warned Tony Falk, who plays the butt of all jokes type of role, not to bring out a cake because you know what happens then. Mick Tierney turned on Hales and went berserk to where all the faces and heels had to hold him back as he tried to attack promoter Buddy Wayne to portray him as a killer. The show heavily plugged the February 14th WWF pay-per-view show and said Power Pro wrestlers would be on the card. Sean Stasiak was claiming Stacy was stalking him. They were building from an angle on the December 10th show in Lula, Mississippi, which they aired, where Stacy accidentally threw powder in Lawler's eyes, costing Lawler and Bill Dundee the main event against Brian Christopher and Stasiak. Dundee and Samantha then came out and told Lawler Stacy did it on purpose and that they thought Stacy also wanted Stasiak. As Lawler and Dundee argued, Christopher and Stasiak laughed about it. Tierney returned later in the show and tried to attack Dave Brown, Corey Macklin and Hales, but Baldo, Christopher, and Vic Grimes stopped him. Falk brought in the cake and Brown said he didn't want the cake around because everyone knows what happens with cakes on wrestling TV shows. They played party music and fans chanted steroids at Stasiak. Falk started singing Happy Birthday and said he'd finally win a match to celebrate, but ended up losing in seconds to Blade. Hales called Falk a loser and piece of trash and said he never wanted to see him around again. Later in the show, Falk begged for one more chance, but Hales said no way. So Falk put his own face in the cake. Brown said that was the weirdest thing he'd seen with a cake on a wrestling show. Main was Stasiak and Christopher versus Lawler and Dundee. Stacy took a chain away from Stasiak and threw it to Lawler, but ref Downtown Bruno saw Lawler with the chain and ordered a DQ, and naturally Dundee was mad because she cost them the match. Show ended with Brandon Baxter stealing Hale's car and driving off. NWA MCW on Christmas night in Nashville is going with Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins and Bart Sawyer versus Wolfie D and Flash Flanagan and Ashley Hudson in a cage as its main event. Riggins is currently out of action with kidney stones. The Brotherhood, the current NWA Tag Champs, Aerts and Knuckles Nelson, are supposed to show up on this group's television soon. Colorado Kid will defend this company's North American title on an NWA Florida show on January 24th in Winter Haven, Connecticut against Greg Valentine. It is said that Honey Love, Bert Prentice, is by far the best old-style heel manager these days in the country. Of course, second best would be Bill Alfonso, Yamaguchi-san, or Sonny Wanu. So, a correction on the MCW Thanksgiving attendance in Nashville. We reported 250, but the actual number was 329. World Legion Wrestling on December 27th in Springfield, Missouri has Yokozuna, Renegade, and Debbie Combs appearing. The show's debut on America One and American Independent Network has been moved to February. Becky Levi, a shoot fighter who has trained with Dan Severn and Don Fry and has a 3-0 record in MMA and with about 1 week of boxing training, took second in a Tough Woman pay-per-view national championship event. Levi has a win over a male pro wrestler in less than 1 minute in a shoot in Texas, faces Angel Amoroso, who actually did the L1 shoot show in Japan, in her pro wrestling debut on December 27th for Hellfire Wrestling, which is the promotion being run by ICP and Dan Curtis, at Majestic Theater in Detroit. On the NWA Coraluzzo show in Baltimore on December 12th, which drew 300, which included Bob Backlund, Tito Santana, Nikolai Volkov, Stevie Richards, King Mabel, Bart Gunn, and Doug Gilbert, Sid Vicious no-showed both the main event and the autograph session. Vicious also no-showed his indie bookings the previous weekend, including one for Lou Reardon in New York. Due to all his no-shows in New York, the New York State Athletic Commission won't allow any promoter in the state to advertise that he'll be appearing on a show. As it pertains to the previous week, when he was called about why he wasn't at the show, a family member answered and said he was out hunting. The next day when he was called, he claimed that his sister had gotten in a car accident and he had to go to Texas, but another family member earlier that day had told promoters that he was planning on lifting in the morning and hunting in the afternoon. As it pertains to this weekend, according to Coraluzzo, he tried to call him to make airline arrangements and never got a call back, so Vicious never got a ticket and never came, because no ticket had arrived. New Dimension promoter Chris Plano was at the recent Major League Baseball winter meetings trying to put together deals to run indie wrestling shows in conjunction with baseball games. All Pro Wrestling will be running January 15th in San Jose, California at Mount Pleasant High with Michael Modest versus Christopher Daniels, who are the two best indie workers in California, as the headline, and January 16th in Hayward, California at Tennyson High. APW is looking at bringing Reckless Youth in for either February or March. An indie show on December 5th in Maple Grove, Minnesota as a benefit drew a reported 1,800 fans, with Jake Roberts versus the Grappler, Lynn Denton, on top. Grappler replaced an injured Kurt Hennig. ISBW on December 27th in Clifton, New Jersey at Courtside Pub has draws versus Blue Meanie plus Luna, Devon Storm, Ace Darling, Lance Diamond, and Twiggy Ramirez. For more info you can call 973-684-3137. Also, the same group is running January 8th in Paterson, New Jersey at the Catholic High with a Royal Rumble plus cage ladder match. It's been reported that indie wrestler Corporal Robinson suffered a brain aneurysm on an IWA show on December 10th and had emergency surgery the next day. Ian Rotten hit Robinson with a weapon brought by a fan, which cut an artery in Robinson's temple. There has been tremendous pub for the new Roller Jam over the past week, including an article in the December 14th Sports Illustrated and a front page story in the December 11th USA Today. The latter piece claims the Nashville Network's version is one of at least 6 promotions in the planning stages built around the old roller derby, largely timed at this point to capitalize on the pro wrestling boom as everyone is looking to create the next sport that isn't pro wrestling, which is on the verge of oversaturation and overexposure. But that is enough like pro wrestling to draw from that audience base, and Derby has the closest demographic similarities to the wrestling audience in the early 50s and again the late 60s and early 70s. Of course, that's a very different wrestling audience than today, as the 50s audience was an older crowd that would attend matches in their suits and ties. The article said they aren't just going after the wrestling audience, but also the NASCAR audience because it has the speed and crash element, and the Springer audience because of the soap opera scripted storylines and the attempt to market tall, sexy women as the female stars, including one team's women's lineup that will be nicknamed the Bod Squad. USA noted that Little Richard Brown, 51, a star with the old Philadelphia roller games of the 60s and 70s, and an amazing skater and stuntman, will be among the stars. Nick Skopas, the husband of the late Joan Weston, will be a manager, and former promoter Jerry Seltzer talked about bringing roller derby back to Madison Square Garden in the year 2000. The article also stated Derby is the subject of a book due next spring, 2 current movies and a handful of TV documentaries all in the works. MMA. There is some irony with the January 9th IFC show in Montreal, since it was the Quebec government that arrested fighters and officials, including Booker John Peretti and among others, Steve Nelson, having to spend a weekend in a foreign prison after an EFC show that was held in what was supposedly sovereign Indian land in Quebec. The show, which will have a tournament that will include Gary Goodridge, Jean Riviere, EFC, K1, and Travis Fulton, Pancrase, is being billed as mixed boxing, is fully legal and commission sanctioned. The only significant change from most MMA rules is that striking to the face from the full mount is banned, so it creates a weird strategy where fighters will switch from full mount to side mount if they want to hit to the face. Even more irony concerns an event held in San Jose on December 6 called Battle of the Big Boys, a tough man type contest that drew a sellout 6,000 fans with just 5 days of promotion by the local top-rated drive time radio station. One of the DJs did an Andy Kaufman and challenged any women in the area, although I believe they had to weigh over 200 pounds to fight him. It was a sick spectacle as this DJ literally destroyed a series of 7 overweight untrained women in a row, bloodying up several, knocking one out for about 2 minutes, and overall showing no mercy in a display that even shocked area fighters who routinely accept brutality in their own world. The matches allowed both boxing and wrestling techniques, wearing 18-ounce gloves, including punching while down, but didn't allow submissions, obviously, because that would be brutal. When Kyoko Inoue, who was a trained athlete, fought a male Muay Thai fighter in Japan, that was sick, but I figured that's Japan and it would never be allowed in this country. Come to find out it's happening a few miles from my home and the commission, which won't let anything resembling UFC or even Pancrase for that matter, into this state with trained fighters, will allow a man to beat up a series of overweight untrained women under the guise of tough man contests. Even though pay-per-view companies in Los Angeles won't air UFC because of brutality, Channel 22 in Los Angeles is now airing from 9:30 to 11 p.m. every Friday night Vale Tudo or pro wrestling shows from around the world, including Vale Tudo from Russia, Brazil, United States and Japan, and even rings from Japan and Holland. As it regards UFC coming to Nevada, which seems to be what UFC is holding out hope for, figuring if the most powerful commission in the country approves their sport, the cable companies would turn around since the big ones have cited lack of commission approval as a reason for not carrying the event. The reality is there is no guarantee, because many recent UFCs, the ones in Louisiana and Mississippi including the next one, have been sanctioned by state athletic or boxing commissions. There will be more discussions early next year, with the 2 main points of concern by the commission being the gloves with exposed fingers, although the eye injuries that made boxing gloves fingerless because of accidental poking have to my knowledge never occurred in a UFC match, and the allowing of striking an opponent on the ground. This may be a stalemate because I'm not sure those could be negotiable points, because wearing regulation boxing gloves really limits wrestling and grappling techniques. Mark Coleman is either coming, or has already arrived in San Diego to train for the rest of the month with Ken Shamrock, Jerry Bolander, Mikey Burnett and Pete Williams at the new Lions Den for his UFC match with Pedro Rizzo. ECW. With no shows the past week, most of the news has revolved around departures and rumored departures. The only definites gone are still Mikey Whipwreck and Chastity to WCW, largely because Raven convinced Diamond Dallas Page to bring them in. Whipwreck is expected to be programmed with Billy Kidman, as if there aren't a dozen people under contract in WCW who are better than Whipwreck that should be. Chastity will be Raven's sister and to eventually become a member of Raven's newest flock. I guess the story will be something along the lines of Raven's mother sending his sister and his best friend from childhood, played by Jim Sandman Fullington, to clean him up and get him out of his depression. They will come in straight-laced, but after a few weeks, instead of them cleaning him up, he dirties them up and they end up under his spell. There were rumors about others leaving. The biggest rumors regarded Chris Candido and Tammy Sytch, particularly since they on their own website claim to be on a tropical vacation, as opposed to being on a suspension or technically a leave of absence, and you can just imagine what it takes nowadays to get suspended from any organization, let alone ECW, considering offers from WWF and WCW. WCW probably would still take Sytch, despite her rep. Hey, they signed Hellwig to a 7-figure deal and gave Rodman more money in one day than anyone in this entire industry except Hogan and Austin make in an entire year, and take Candido to get her. But Sytch has a 5-year contract with ECW. Joey Styles on the ECW website basically said that anyone who believes they are on vacation is naive, not exactly using those words, and Candido was so mad at that saying he would never work for ECW again, and insisting that he wasn't doing a Brian Pillman angle, using the internet to create his own angle. Although Tammy may have to fulfill obligations because of her merchandising contract, claiming that while they are under contract, Paul Heyman had told them if they wanted to leave, he'd let them out of their deal. Hopefully Candido can get himself together because his stock as one of the brightest young stars in the business has taken a tumble of late. The original plan was to bring them both back on December 26th in Queens to do an angle to set up something for the pay-per-view, but that at least at this point is out the window and he's considered questionable for the pay-per-view. Big Dick Dudley was fired in Altoona, but may be brought back either for a blow-off angle, or to work some shots but not on a full-time basis. It has been discussed within the WWF about bringing him in with a new gimmick that Vince Russo came up with. I've been led to believe that may happen, although it's not official. Supernova is still around, although Al Snow is trying to get him into WWF. High Times magazine is working on a story on Van Dam. Paul Heyman has been trying to sign Jerry Lynn, Lance Storm and several others to contracts, and pretty much the rest of the money talent besides them are all signed up long-term. He's also been on the hunt for new talent. Reckless Youth will either start at the December 26th show in Queens against Nova if he doesn't have commitments elsewhere, or in late January. Yoshihiro Tajiri and Antifaz del Norte will wrestle on December 19th at the ECW Arena. Super Crazy debuts in Queens. Rex King will be brought in for a few dates and Robert Gibson will be coming in for a short time mainly for television tapings doing an angle to elevate Danny During. Tajiri is a very good technical worker, but really small like 5'3", and doesn't have a lot of charisma or crowd interaction. Antifaz, who is the son of the wrestling promoter in Monterrey, doesn't have a great rep as a worker based on much of what we've heard, but looked super in his WWF Super Astros debut match without the hood as Manuel Gomez. Super Crazy, who wrestled as Hysteria in AAA, is an excellent bump taker in the psychosis mold. He's one of those big risk takers who can miss spots, and he has that Mexican style offense that isn't Americanized enough yet, so he may look bad at the beginning but is probably the kind of a guy who once he learns to mesh with the style, his ring work will be spectacular, and he's got charisma. Conan is also interested in him if the new Telemundo show gets off the ground. This week's TV was built around setting up the Just Incredible vs. Tommy Dreamer ladder match, showing each costing the other the match. They did some angles to build up Mikey Whipwreck as a heel chicken and to show off Chastity as a sex symbol with the new boobs, but those are all out the window. They also had Supernova take the makeup off his face and basically try to portray himself no longer as a comedy figure. Lance Wright will be finishing up probably in the next few weeks. He wanted a raise, and was turned down. ECW from a business standpoint is restructuring with Paul Heyman largely getting out of that end. He'll remain owner, but is going to delegate business decisions and negotiations to a group of more than a half dozen others so he can spend more time booking and producing. There is strong consideration to actually going with Van Dam vs. Lynn as the main event for the 3/21 pay-per-view show, or at least have the two work the final match on the show. There are, in fact, plans formulating for a newsstand ECW magazine through H&S Media out of Chicago. The deal is for 6 issues per year along with poster books and posters. WCW. There is a huge deal that hasn't been finalized at press time, but if it is, has potentially huge positive repercussions as it regards this company's position in the wrestling war. Eric Bischoff had another meeting with Talent before Nitro on December 14th. He officially told Talent that Kevin Nash and Diamond Dallas Page would be joining in the booking team with himself, Kevin Sullivan and Dusty Rhodes, and that Terry Taylor would be moving over to production. Bischoff heavily stressed all the wrestlers being easy to find at least 2 segments before they go on television for any fine-tuning of what they need to do, and the need for wrestlers to hit their time marks better since it's a live television shoot. He, without saying names, talked about people doing interviews or matches for longer than they are scheduled and how it messes with the timing of the show. He spoke about big changes coming in January with the company. He said that they are going to reinvent wrestling early next year, claiming they did so once and will do it again, and told everyone he didn't want them attempting to compete on a vulgarity level with WWF. He claimed that he watched both shows on December 7th, and he believes WCW has a better television show but that WWF is gaining attention of teenagers because it's more vulgar. The point he's missing is that WWF is gaining the attention of teenagers to a huge degree for its shock value and swearing, but it is also the better television show most weeks, particularly from a storyline standpoint. He really emphasized not tolerating changing finishes, and he got to put his foot down on December 14th when Stevie Ray complained about doing a job for Conan. Ray went up the ladder to complain, and when it got to Bischoff, he totally put his foot down about it. Bret Hart's torn groin hasn't healed much, and it looks like the original plan for Hart vs. Scott Hall for the US title at Starrcade may be changed to Hall vs. Bam Bam Bigelow. Despite the angle, Ric Flair is scheduled to work a full-time house show schedule starting at Starrcade. Flair had minor surgery last month to remove a cataract from his right eye. Everyone is noticing just how rapidly Bill Goldberg is cooling off. A few months back his merchandise was huge, and now it's actually nicknamed Coldberg. For whatever reason, WCW has either decided not to, or simply never decided to, promote the Hart movie on its television even though it sponsored at least one of its grand openings. The one mentioned on December 7th by Gene Okerlund, in passing without saying when it airs or what it is, was something Okerlund decided to do on his own. December 14th Nitro from Tampa drew a sellout 13,187, 10,464 paying $206,232. Raven was supposed to wrestle Scott Putski, but he started blaming his mother for everything. Kanyon came out and said that Raven had a great childhood, that he went to an Ivy League school and was pre-med, had a $3.2 million trust fund, and basically was a spoiled and not deprived kid. This got old live in a hurry and Raven walked out. Eddie Guerrero no contest with Villano V in 6:13. Good TV match, particularly the work of Villano. Art Flores interfered and Guerrero frog splashed him and refused to pin him, and instead the LWO came out and they offered him a shirt and he took it. While there are rumors everywhere that the LWO will be broken up in a few weeks, reported on the WCW hotline, and it may be true, that would really be strange if it was because on December 15th, they were sending all of them to El Paso to shoot a series of vignettes where they wash Eddie's car and basically get over that Eddie is using them even worse than Bischoff did. Wrath gave Al Green the meltdown in 3:43. Bischoff did an interview. Flair came out and challenged him and chased him. One thing. Compared to the WWF's usual chase scenes, this was far more believable because in WWF, everyone moves in such slow motion that there's no intensity, and both these guys were running like they were training to set age group records in the 100. And Flair came back from that and wasn't even breathing hard, but then he had the worked heart attack and was carried out. You could tell when they segued that right into the backstage brawl with Goldberg, Nash, and Bigelow, that it was a work. The announcers' reactions were a total giveaway. None of the fans believed it live as they didn't act concerned at all, as everyone did that night when Bagwell was really hurt. They had both Dusty Rhodes and Arn Anderson come out and acted concerned. Bigelow first attacked Hall before they had the three-way deal backstage, and Taylor ordered a three-way match that would have no outside interference as the main event. Kidman offered a title shot to Mysterio Jr., and they had a very good match with So-So Heat before the LWO attacked both guys. Ray and Kidman did some great double-team spots after the match, first on Damien and Cyclope, then on La Parka and Psychosis before the entire group destroyed them and Guerrero frog splashed both of them. Chris Jericho and Ralphus did an interview. The first half was almost identical to a very good interview that aired 2 days earlier. He then brought out a Conan spoof guy and it was a riot from that point on. Barry Windham pinned Emery Hale with a superplex in 2:30. Hale took good bumps for his size but overall didn't look as good as last week. Pretty dead match. Norman Smiley pinned Perry Saturn due to outside interference with a kick from Ernest Miller in 4:52. They piped in this unbelievably fake-sounding crowd noise to make up for the lack of heat. Smiley and Saturn didn't mix well, but the crowd noise mixed even worse. The first ref was knocked out so Scott Dickinson ran in, saw Miller interfere, but fast-counted Saturn anyway. It was revenge for Saturn giving him a DVD last week. Tony Schiavone went on and on about Dickinson being friends with Mike Tenay. Hart did an interview challenging Page. As Page came out, the Giant clocked him from behind with a chair and destroyed him, ripping up the set and choke slamming him off the set and through a table. Conan kept the TV title beating Ray in 3:06 with a facebuster after Ray and Booker T argued. This actually wasn't a bad match, which is a miracle. Bischoff did a somber interview apologizing to all of Flair's friends, fans, family, etc. Actually, this interview was so bizarre that it may have gotten a few people believing the angle, but not too many as it appeared. Ray and T argued again with Ray giving T a t-shirt and T not turning it down. Raven's mom showed up backstage and asked Kanyon to bring her to him, but Kanyon wanted $50 because he was broke and she's rich. Hall beat Horace Hogan via DQ in 6:25 when Scott Norton, Ray, Vincent and Bryan Adams did a run-in. Disco Inferno wearing a Wolfpack shirt ran in, but got destroyed. Scott Steiner beat Van Hammer in 1:23 with the camel clutch. Steiner and Bagwell then tried to recruit Lex Luger to join the Black and White. They said it was Nash who cost him the title shot by eliminating him in the Battle Royal. They said that Conan never asked him to be in the video, and that Sting had left him. Luger never answered. Finally, the three-way with no interference ended with no contest when Hall ran in to attack Bigelow in 5 minutes. Unfortunately, this left Nash versus Goldberg for a few seconds and it wasn't pretty. This definitely hurt the build-up for their Starrcade match as it just didn't seem very exciting, let alone any good, when they faced off. The original plan was to have Goldberg versus Bigelow singles at Nitro in St. Louis, and the triangle match with Nash to headline Nitro in Atlanta. Keiji Muto, who is in Minnesota undergoing treatment on his bad knees, is scheduled to shoot an angle with Norton at the December 21st Nitro to set up their Tokyo Dome IWGP title match. First day ticket sales for San Diego 1,053 and Los Angeles 4,166 for loaded house shows on January 29th and January 30th were disappointing, as was Indianapolis 2,734 for Thunder on January 21st. Sold out on January 17th and Charleston, West Virginia sold out in like 1 hour. Nitro in Columbus on January 18th did 9,975 tickets. The first day in Nitro in Dallas on January 25th at Reunion Arena sold 9,743 tickets for $303,350 on the first day. Business overall is still very good, but they are clearly trailing WWF by more than in a long time, and not nearly as hot a live event product as they were a few months back. On November 27th in the UK, Nitro had 270,000 viewers, Raw had 250,000 and Thunder had 100,000, which is its lowest total to date. ECW averages 85,000 viewers for 1996 shows that air 5 nights per week on the Bravo channel. The Diamond Dallas Page charity show in Asbury Park, New Jersey on December 12th drew about 1,500 fans at very high ticket prices, $100 ringside. Page beat Giant via DQ, and after the match, Giant got in the ring, did a babyface speech, and he and Page both hugged. Also working the show for Page were Wrath, Lodi, Kidman, Disco Inferno, Alex Wright, Glacier, Conan, Saturn Raven, and Canyon. Disco was running down New Jersey and Bigelow did an unannounced run-in giving him the greetings from Asbury Park. In the local TV ads for the show, they pushed WCW names, but in the background aired footage from Raw. Hogan and Randy Savage had a meeting on December 11th with Bischoff about angles for their return. WCW has some tentative big plans for early 1999 that no doubt they want to be part of. A scenario was discussed where Hogan and Savage would return as a face tag team to feud with Hall and Nash. If that happens, it won't last long because nobody is going to cheer Hogan no matter how heelish Hall and Nash get. The President deal seems to have lost all steam, so Hogan is probably now sitting back and waiting for this regime to fail. One of the deals also is that just like nobody wanted to see Hall versus Nash, so their feud bombed. Nobody wants to see Hogan and Savage together as a team, only against each other. Savage was in Tampa for Nitro and was said to look to be the biggest and most cut up anyone had ever seen him, and he's 46. Also looked to have grown new hair. Hogan is booked on Stern this week. Stern made Hogan look bad a few years back the last time he was on, and with this President thing, well, if Hogan thought Jay Leno made him look bad. Wrath's contract has expired and he has given 90 days notice. Since everyone knows what kind of big money WCW is offering guys, Wrath is looking to get a huge raise. Giant is strongly leaning toward leaving again. McMichael no-showed Nitro on December 14th. The November 22nd National Enquirer had a story on Scott Hall as told by Dana. Nothing you don't already know. I wouldn't take seriously much in the Enquirer, but it was largely accurate. The December 14th Sports Illustrated noted that the Eagles vs. Rams NFL game on December 3rd on ESPN at a 4.5 rating, the lowest rating ever for an NFL game on that network, and that Thunder on TBS head-to-head drew a 3.9. Actually, it was a 3.7, but it's really amazing just how close wrestling came to football. And even though it was a poor marquee football game, exactly how much marquee value does a Thunder show have? TNT airs a Best of Nitro special, dating back to its debut in 1995, on December 30th at 8 p.m. and replayed on December 31st at 5 p.m. Sting is doing a TV movie called Shutter Speed as a pilot for a potential series. Vampiro's debut has been pushed back to Super Brawl in San Francisco. Only show this week was Tampa, which did $50,419 in merchandise, or a record low week for the year of $4.82 per head. Thunder on December 10th did a very strong 3.93 rating and 6.2 share. There's no reasonable explanation as to why, as the TV main was Conan and Luger versus Ray and Vincent and Horace. WCW Saturday Night on December 12th did a 2.6 rating. WWF. There's really no conclusive word on the condition of Steve Austin. He got a gastrointestinal attack while on the flight to England and was so sick that he had to cancel all his promotional appearances and couldn't eat for 4 days. Luckily he had the week off before the pay-per-view to rest. He was still recovering from the virus at press time, although he was able to eat regular meals by December 14th. The injury suffered in the pay-per-view match was to be examined on December 15th, and there wasn't even any speculation as to if he could make or wrestle on the Chicago and Madison Square Garden shows. The People magazine photo spread where Austin is named one of the breakout new stars of 1998 comes out this week. There is also nothing conclusive that can be stated about the condition of Jim Ross. It appeared his attack of Bell's palsy wasn't as serious as when he suffered the attack 4 years ago, but there is no timetable as to recovery and when he can be back on the air. He's suffering severe headaches which result in periods of blurred vision as well. About a week before his mother died, his only uncle, his mother's brother, had died and he was close to both of them, so he went through about as trying a period as you can imagine. It isn't inconceivable he could be back for the TV tapings at the end of the month, but there is no way of even estimating a timetable. TV tapings on December 14th at the Tacoma Dome drew a sellout 17,508 paying $409,430. The live show opened with a tryout match with Sumito beating Timothy Flowers. For Super Astros, Armando Fernandez beat Shoichi Funaki and Apollo Dantes beat El Merenguero, Jesus Castillo, by a DQ. Bradshaw and Farouk beat Blue Meanie and Dwayne Gill in a match that had no heat. In another Super Astros match, Papi Chulo beat Buddy Wayne. The live Raw opened with a hilarious DX spoof on Team Corporate. Billy Gunn played Shane with a silver spoon wearing a diaper, and he pulled off the diaper and bent over and showed his ass. Road Dogg was Vince and he was okay with the mannerisms. X-Pac was a lame Ken Shamrock. Triple H was a tremendous Rock, and Jason Sensation stole the show as HB Gay. They also had two minis with their noses glued to dogs, Butts Patterson and Briscoe. Sensation kept dropping a basketball to signify Triple H's line about WrestleMania about Michaels dropping the ball. This brought out Michaels, Rock, Shamrock, and Bossman, and Michaels ordered Outlaws to defend the belts against Shamrock and Bossman. Rock challenged Triple H to a non-title match, but Triple H goaded him into making it a title match. Rock did the same interview as in England doing everyone's catchphrases, and Michaels really played it up when Rock was doing Bret Hart. Godfather and Val Venus beat Edge and Christian in 2:34 when Venus pinned Christian with a fisherman suplex. Goldust beat Blue Blazer via DQ in 2:10 when Jarrett interfered. Blackman made the save and unmasked Blazer as Owen Hart. Hopefully that ends that lame shtick. Sexual Chocolate, Mark Henry, and D'Lo Brown beat Bob Holly and Scorpio when Henry pinned Scorpio after Jacqueline used a missile dropkick on Holly in 2:59. Shamrock and Bossman beat Outlaws to win the tag titles in 6:44. Decent match ending when Michaels hit Gunn with a nightstick and Shamrock put him in the ankle lock. Just for consistency, Gunn was knocked out so he was neither pinned nor submitted, but the title changed hands anyway. Vince and Shane came out and picked Austin as the first entrant in the Rumble. Vince said someone who never had wrestled in the WWF and the only man who could save Ted Turner's WCW would be in the Rumble, and then said it was him, and he picked number 30. Vince also offered a $100,000 bounty to whomever eliminates Austin. Jarrett beat Blackman in a guitar on a pole match in 3:31 when Hart hit Blackman with a guitar after a ref bump. Blackman had the match won, but Deborah pulled down her blouse. The Brood then all destroyed Singh, who was covered in blood as they came back from a commercial break. Although this didn't air, in the building they were doing a gimmick that they were sucking the blood from him. Mankind vs. Kane had one of those non-endings, as McMahon challenged Mankind to fight outside while Shamrock and Bossman beat up Kane and the orderlies took him away to be committed. In the parking lot, Mankind threw Vince, Patterson, and Briscoe into a garage door. It looked one hell of a lot better than when Hall and Nash did the same angle on Nitro a few months back. Rock and Mankind ended up on top of a car and Rock gave him the rock bottom on the hood, smashing that up. Rock beat Triple H in 10:51 to keep the title. Michaels was at ringside. Rock did the spot where he does his own commentary. The corporate elbow still gets a gigantic face pop. It was an old-style match with some basic high spots and long rest holds, but Rock's charisma is such that he doesn't have to do much to get heat. Rock's gyno was looking really unsightly as he's almost becoming a man with breasts. They tease a lot of Shawn vs. Triple H spots. China low-blowed Rock and Triple H hit a DDT for a near fall. Triple H hit the pedigree but no ref. Shawn hit Triple H with the title belt but Triple H kicked out. Finally China went after Shawn, and Andrew Martin ran in and gave Triple H the meltdown to set up the pin. Martin, as would be fitting Team Corporate, is going to have the name test. which is short for testosterone, so now they're actually naming wrestlers after steroids. For Heat, X-Pac beat Singh, who was showing no effects of all his blood being sucked out 20 minutes earlier. Snow beat Draws when Hawk hit him with a cast on his arm. Brian Christopher and Kevin Quinn, with Scott Taylor on crutches in the corner, beat Hardy Boys. Oddities vs. Headbangers had one of those non-finishes after 1 minute, when they had this giant present and the Bangers opened the box up to reveal George Steele, 61, who got an amazing pop and ran around the ring with his green tongue eating turnbuckles. Outlaws beat DOA when Paul Ellering's interference backfired. Outlaws then turned on Ellering and beat him up. He was useless anyway. Shane McMahon then insulted the fans for 10 minutes. Show ended with a four-way with Rock, Shamrock and Bossman all destroying poor Mankind, and Rock pinned him. Vince tired to put Mr. Socko Claw on Mankind, but Mankind blocked it and DX made the save, and the show ended with Mankind and DX in the ring crotch chopping. Sable is home training for her Playboy photo shoot, which is in a few weeks. The issue will be out in April. It's not guaranteed to be on the cover, but if they know what's good for them as far as selling magazines, it will be. She has been given creative control of what shots can or can't go in. Rochester Roadblock has been talked with about coming in as a masked wrestler, who would be Golga's brother. The Christopher/Taylor wedding is planned for the February 14th pay-per-view from Memphis. Wonder if Lawler will give away the bride. It's said that Christopher and Lawler are both heavily against this angle. Worse because it's in Memphis. This is one of those angles with a little bit of short-term upside but could be a career killer over the long haul. If you're wondering why they are doing this angle, it's because McMahon found out that Lawler really isn't Christopher's father. His real father is Bret Hart. You're supposed to laugh at this point. Mark Canterbury has yet to have his neck surgery, so he's at least 3 months before coming back. Steven Regal finished rehab on December 9th. Despite reports to the contrary, he is still with the company and expected to be back at the next set of tapings. Also, despite rumors to the contrary, there are no plans for Michaels to wrestle at any time soon. If he's given the okay, he'll be in the ring, and if he's okay, he probably will face Triple H at WrestleMania or wherever the storyline takes things at that week, but there are no plans in that direction. There wasn't much to Super Astros this week aside from funny promos for the Rock Bottom pay-per-view where they called the WWF champion La Roca and the tag champs Los Farajados Modernos. Undertaker and Stone Cold are simply Undertaker and Stone Cold. El Hijo del Santo had 3 major problems with his WWF contract. After showing it to his lawyers, they red-flagged clauses that would have given McMahon control over negotiations for him to do movies, a clause that would have given McMahon the right to trademark the Santo name, and a clause that would have given McMahon the legal right to have him unmask. Apparently those clauses will be removed and he is expected to sign before the end of the year. Bart Gunn is apparently training with the idea of possibly trying pro boxing. The rumors about a Gunn vs. Tank Abbott Brawl for All match aren't at all out of the realm of possibility. Madison Square Garden for December 27th sold out this past week. At press time, the December 26th Chicago show had only 1,800 tickets left. Meadowlands on January 17th already has 12,500 tickets sold for $308,000. Royal Rumble on January 24th in Anaheim has 10,957 tickets sold and 3,500 left. WrestleMania hasn't even gone on sale to the public, but through mail orders has already done 13,429 tickets for $1,055,410. The November 30th Baltimore Sun ran an article on Draws, 29, who played defensive line for the University of Maryland from 1988 to 1992. Draws played 1 season with the Denver Broncos, 1993, before blowing out his knee and having a failed attempt to make the Montreal Alouettes of the CFL. He said pro wrestling is more physical and much more strenuous than pro football. In the latest Billboard magazine list of sports video sales, Austin 3:16 was number 1, Sable Unleashed was number 2, Cause Stone Cold Said So was number 3, Best of WrestleMania was number 5, Best of Survivor Series was number 7, Undertaker, The Phenom was number 8, Three Faces of Foley was number 9, DX was number 10, Sting Unmasked was number 11, Mayhem in Manchester was number 13, 1998 Royal Rumble was number 15, WrestleMania 14 was number 16, Best of Halloween Havoc was number 18, Breakdown in Your House was number 19, and Best of Bash at the Beach was number 20. WWF is promoting no bull sessions where wrestlers go to high schools and tell kids to stay in school and warn them against using drugs. Let's just hope they are very careful who they send, or they should be named full of bull sessions. In the 80s, even though they used to have guys like Warrior warn kids not to use drugs, maybe kids were a bit more naive, although it's hard to believe they were that naive. Today everyone knows, and while the kids will be starstruck when the wrestlers come to their school, they'll see through phoniness on the drug issue pretty darn easy, and at that point, what value does any of it have? Kind of funny that the WWF sends wrestlers to schools to preach against drugs, and McMahon 1 week earlier went to Oxford to brag about the highs he would get when doing steroids, which I guess sounds cooler than the hepatitis. M&M Mars signed a multi-year sponsorship deal with the WWF valued at more than $10 million. Coca-Cola is said to be considering a major WWF marketing program next year as well. WWF is claiming that in October, they attracted more 18 to 34 males than either Friends or Monday Night Football. That figure is true. When adding up the combined audience that watches all of its syndicated shows and all of its cable shows, and Raw is considered as two different shows. If you added up the total audience of 18 to 34 males of 7 NFL games or 7 straight weeks of Friends, which would be a more fair comparison, the numbers would tell a different story. Mick Foley was number 2 on the Time magazine internet balloting for Man of the Year. Of course, Linda Tripp was number 7 when it was announced on Raw. At the time he had 2,000 votes. By the next day, he had more than 34,000 votes and was in first place. Ric Flair was high on the same poll for Man of the Century. And how many times has WCW mentioned it? I swear sometimes that WWF books to get everyone they can over, and WCW has performers booking to make sure nobody but them and their friends get over. I mentioned to one prominent WCW performer about how Goldberg is flattening out, and the response was, "What do you expect when you have bookers in charge whose primary goal is to take his spot?" The only show this week was Tacoma with $156,463 in merchandise, or $9.26 per head. Weekend ratings for December 12th and 13th saw Livewire at 1.7, Superstars at 1.6 and Heat at 3.76 rating with a 6.1 share. The Reader's Pages. Misawa Kobashi. Having recently viewed the recent Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Kenta Kobashi Triple Crown title match, I must say this is one of the greatest matches I've ever seen. The funny thing is, this isn't even the greatest match these two have had, nor is it even the greatest match in all Japan this decade. I believe their January 1997 match was even better. My all-time favorite All Japan match was the 1994 Classic with Misawa vs. Toshiaki Kawada, ending with Misawa dropping poor Kawada on his head with a Tiger Driver 91. I only wish that Kobashi could catch a break and have a longer title reign and finally pin Misawa in a title match and thus establish himself as the man in All Japan. Maybe next year at the Tokyo Dome Kobashi can get his biggest win just like Kawada this year. This year's awards will end up being a one-man show. I agree Steve Austin deserves everything accolade he will receive, but I hope the readers don't forget about the other talented wrestlers out there. Mick Foley deserves the praise of every wrestling fan. He has single-handedly resurrected the career of The Undertaker and made WWF pay-per-view shows this year enjoyable. At his current rate, he may not live to be 60 or watch his children grow up, but I guess you've got to do what you've got to do to entertain the fans. To me, a fan means enjoying and appreciating the wrestlers and wrestling and not being there to see a suicide stunt show and chanting UF it up if a wrestler misses a move. Your assessment of the New Japan Juniors being the most modern and innovative workers was right on the money. These guys are constantly updating their style to attempt to keep things fresh. An example in Shinjiro Otani's new spinning powerbomb. This move has my vote for best move of the year. As it regards Jushin Liger, no other performer this decade has been involved in as many classic matches. Can anyone actually remember a bad Liger match? The ironic thing is that he's been surpassed by the best of the juniors in New Japan. He can still put on a great match, but all those years as a daredevil have finally caught up with him. I shudder to think how guys like Rey Mysterio Jr. and Psychosis will spend their later years. The proof for Mysterio Jr. is how out of sync he seems to be since his comeback. He's lost a step in some of his trademark quickness. Why can't WCW let him properly heal, and why do they insist of rushing him back? Here's hoping that WWF signs him and rebuilds their junior heavyweight division around him. I also hope WWF signs Chris Benoit and Chris Jericho. Who wouldn't want to see Benoit versus Austin as a pay-per-view main event? Why does New Japan let WCW get away with sending slugs like Bryan Adams, Rage, Chaos, etc. over? New Japan sends a talented guy like Yuji Nagata over and WCW jobs him into the ground. When Bryan Adams goes to Japan, he doesn't sell or job. Where's the logic in that? Here's hoping New Japan sees the light and ends its talent swapping deal. I just got the New Japan television for September, October, and November. This is what wrestling is all about. Luis Sanchez. Dover, New Hampshire. Wrestling with shadows. There are so many things shimmering under the surface of Hitman Hart, Wrestling with Shadows, that it must be watched 2 or 3 times. Bret Hart should be proud of this movie. Its substantive ambitions will be more enduring than the boundary-less product he criticized. The passing of time will provide some poetic justice if this treasure of a documentary shines and shames all those who cooperated in screwing Hart for their various short-term reasons. Major thumbs up. Kevin Donlin, Baltimore, Maryland. I hadn't felt so out of the loop since I started reading The Observer 6 years ago. Everything for the last 6 weeks has been Bret movie this and Bret movie that. Finally, I've seen the movie. It deserves everything said about it. No one, wrestling fan, casual viewer, non-fan, can deny just how powerful and how real this movie is. Until Wrestling with Shadows, I was pretty convinced this whole situation was a well-orchestrated work. No longer. How real is wrestling to Bret? He'd rather die than do a job for Dino Bravo. That says it all. No wonder Vince plays such a great asshole on Raw. Tributes blew me away. Michael Roper. Chapin, South Carolina. Tamura Overeem. I have to disagree with Steve Yohei's comments on the Valentijn Overeem vs. Kiyoshi Tamura match from April. In front of their third largest crowd of the year, 7,000 fans were left absolutely stunned and discombobulated by what they witnessed. They didn't see a competitive shoot match in any sense of the word. What they did see was a one-sided destruction of who they perceived as one of the best fighters in the world. I personally didn't notice any kind of competition in the match. What I saw was a shocked Tamura getting caught in a choke within 20 seconds and seeing him totally shocked as he had no idea how he got caught in one awesome guillotine. You could tell Tamura was totally at a loss for what to do after being caught in the second choke about 2:50 into the match. He had this look on his face I will never forget, like a deer in the headlights. I honestly believe he had no idea what to do with him. Overeem beat him at every turn, including, and probably most surprising to all, in submissions. Tamura wasn't competitive with Overeem at any point. This was definitely the match that changed the course of the company. Notice after this match attendance went from sellout shows to half houses like the May show where Tamura lost the title to Bitsazad Terriel. I don't think the match with Terriel killed him, because Terriel had some credibility based on all the years he had spent with the company. Overeem came in with no fanfare, of being just another striker from Holland who wouldn't know the ground game, and that's where Tamura would exploit him. But he knew the ground game and in doing so destroyed all of the momentum that Rings had built up since the acquisition of Tamura in 1996. It's interesting since Overeem's dominating clear-cut win that he hasn't been brought back to Rings. I wonder who decided not to bring him back? I would have enjoyed Rings a lot more this year had Overeem continued to fight with this group. It made perfect sense to build for he and Tamura to meet this year in a rematch at the Battle Dimension Tournament Finals. But Rings decided to go with the tournament-killing idea of teams, and we know how that one is turning out. I loved reading Boss Rutan's response to those who say his Pancrase match with Masakatsu Funaki was worked. While he wrote in broken English, I still love the way he got his point across in his own unique way. He doesn't pull any punches, and that's what was great about his letter. Many expect Rutan to run through Tsuyoshi Kosaka in his UFC debut in January. Rutan is my all-time favorite fighter, but I think him running through Kosaka is the farthest thing from the truth. He would have had an easier time with Randy Couture than he will with Kosaka. Kirk Jensen, Maurice Smith's manager, said that Frank Shamrock couldn't even get Kosaka to tap. I don't think John Peretti or Semaphore Entertainment Group realizes they've put Rutan's potential huge box office potential in jeopardy by making this his debut match. Kosaka is as versatile on the ground as any fighter in MMA. The longer the match goes, the more it will favor TK because of his unbelievable stamina. Hopefully for Semaphore Entertainment Group, Rutan will win because if pay-per-view opens up, they need a big drawing card, especially with the prospect of Frank Shamrock not appearing. I imagine this will be a big deal in Japan as it's only the second Pancrase vs. Rings match, Frank Shamrock vs. TK being the first. If you haven't been watching Pancrase, you've been missing the development of the next generation of future MMA stars. Semi-Schild has such awesome potential that it's scary. His reach and the fact he has learned how to use it makes him a very dangerous opponent. Kenga Watanabe has the potential to be, along with Yuki Kondo, the next Funaki and Suzuki of the group. He actually dwarfed Rutan in their match, and he looked very imposing, but he needs a lot of training. He ran right at Rutan, which was dumb, because it was like running right into a freight train. That probably has to do with him being trained by Yoshiki Takahashi, who has always loved that wild style of fighting. The September 14th pay-per-view show, while not the best card of the year, was a very good card and it was way better than their first pay-per-view show. Jonathan D'Antoni. Belrose, New York. Hall of Fame. Can you explain why Bob Backlund is always quickly dismissed from Hall of Fame discussions? Is it because he was inactive for so long? Was he considered a good worker when he was WWF champion? I used to be captivated when someone would do a stretcher job. Now, with wrestlers going to the hospital and to jail every week, it's just like seeing an arm drag or a headlock. These shock angles have no shock value at all anymore. Tributes was great. I wish you could find a way to fit more stories about wrestling history into the Observer without someone having to die. I learned so much from everyone. Where would Art Barr fit in today if he were alive? Steve Russum. Prince Anne, Maryland. Response from Dave Meltzer. Backlund was one of the biggest names in the business from 1978 to 1983 as WWF champion. But his career really didn't amount to much either before or after that reign. Some would point to Satoru Sayama, whose heyday was even shorter and did little after, some before, mainly in Mexico and England, during the same time period that is in, but Sayama's work changed the entire face of the sport, first in Japan, and eventually worldwide, because without him, I doubt there would be any serious stars under 210 pounds in the US or Japan today. Backlund was considered a very well-conditioned athlete, but not a good worker at all. As for Art Barr, who really knows, but if pressed, I'd guess he'd be another real talented guy working the middle of the card in WCW who would be really frustrated. But Sayama's work changed the entire face of the sport, first in Japan, and eventually worldwide, because without him, I doubt there would be any serious stars under 210 pounds in the US or Japan today. Backlund was considered a very well-conditioned athlete, but not a good worker at all. As for Art Barr, who really knows, but if pressed, I'd guess he'd be another real talented guy working the middle of the card in WCW who would be really frustrated.